questions from everybody in the room here and also online. So I think, Julia, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much. So I hope this is going to work okay. My connection is a little bit unstable. So I have prepared a couple of slides to help me talk through the issue of data and why things are can be complicated. So if somebody can run those slides for me, that would be great. I've called this Measuring and Monitoring Financing for Development. And of course, I'm talking about the issues that we have faced in this area for quite a number of years. I have actually worked for the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate for many, many years in terms of, statistical data collection. And now more recently, from the beginning of this year, I'm heading the Secretariat of the International Forum on TOSSD, which is hosted by the OECD, but which is an independent entity. So I have kind of three sections in my presentation. So if we can go to the first one, so you do go to the slide number, the following slide. Yes, I wanted to start the presentation by reflecting upon the evolution of data on financing for development. I mean, that was something that was included in the messages that we had with the organizers before the meeting. I mean, there's certainly something that happened in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and with the Sustainable Development Goals having been agreed, which put in light a need for a new measure of financing for development that would respond to a changing landscape in this area. So there has been a lot of discussion over many years on how there are today more actors participating in development cooperation and also financing for development. There are more instruments that are being used. So it is not only about grants and concessional loans. There are lots of other instruments that are today part of the toolbox for financing for development. And then with 2015 and the SDGs, so certainly a greater focus was placed on sustainable development. So if you go to the next slide, so this is one of the reasons why actually a new measure of total official support for sustainable development was developed. The idea was really to capture this broad landscape. And on the slide, what you see is kind of a reflection on how we can organize the landscape. So first of all, there is the financing that goes directly to developing countries. In our framework, we call it cross-border resource flows. And to be able to look at development cooperation or development finance at the country level, one needs to be able to bring into the picture all providers, so whether it is governments or multilateral organizations, whether it is traditional providers or South-South cooperation providers. One needs to have in the picture also all kinds of financial instruments, so grants, debt instruments, but also blended finance in operations. And all frameworks, so here emphasis being it is bilateral cooperation, but it is also the operations that multilateral organizations like FAO or IFAD in Rome are undertaking directly with developing countries. We need to also include in the picture South-South and triangular cooperation. So this is a reflection on what is happening at the country level. And then, as you know, in the statistics on financing for development, there are all sorts of other expenditures that are being captured. In TOSSD, we call them global and regional expenditures. Some of them are targeting international public goods. So, for example, climate mitigation activities can be an example, or global health is another example. Peace and security, just to give you an example of a development enabler. And what is the thinking here is that to be able to have accurate data on what support is being provided to the country level, these global expenditures, they need to be put in a separate category in a statistical framework. And finally, another element in the 2015 agenda, SDG agenda, is mobilized private finance. That is also a part of the picture, and it is included in TOSST framework for the part that relates to activities that have been initiated by the official sector. So there, the thinking behind, if you like, is that as long as the official sector is involved in these operations, we can have a direct link, or we actually have access to information on how these activities target the Sustainable Development Goals. And it is possible to collect that information at a sufficiently detailed level. Mobilized private finance is linked with the official sector intervention, so it is not about foreign direct investment, so purely private financing, if you like. So I'm telling you now, we can move on to the next slide. This is another presentation of how the landscape of development finance has changed. So as you know, the OECD has been collecting data on financing for development for many, many years. Here, what happened over the last years was that there was a need to really broaden the scope of the data to include all bilateral providers, traditional and southern providers, also collect accurate data, detailed data from multilateral providers. And then you will see that in the all the various components of this big development finance picture. In TOSSD, they go through the sustainability test and are included in the data only if they target the sustainable development goals. Now, on the next slide, what I wanted to show is that it is quite important to bear in mind that indeed financing for development, it goes well beyond concessional finance. And when we talk about the challenges of data, there's often a little bit confusion about what are we really talking about. So, for example, when we talk about ODA, official development assistance, that is only concessional finance, whereas financing for development, the broader concept, it includes other types of financial flows. And here on this slide, I have used a slide that we have prepared for other purposes. It shows how the TOSSD data are being used for an indicator in the SDG indicator framework, which is called 17.3.1, additional financial resources mobilized for developing countries from multiple sources. And here you see that the concessional part is kind of less than half of the total picture based on TOSSD. So that was just to kind of put this in and give some kind of figures or orders of magnitude to have in mind. Now then, next slide, please. So looking a little bit in more detail, financing for the SDGs and in the introductory remarks, you mentioned the challenges of data. So now I'm going to be talking about those a little bit in more detail. So first slide. So one great challenge in producing data on specific themes of development cooperation is that, of course, one activity can have several purposes. And if we look at the SDGs, for example, it is perfectly normal and it is even good if one activity targets at the same time the several SDGs. But that creates a challenge in the analysis of the data. So, for example, the goal 2, which is of our interest today, you will see on the slide that there is a one third approximately of the activities that had been tagged against SDG 2 in the TOSST framework were actually also tagged against other SDGs. So one needs to be very careful in analyzing the data, and one needs to be very careful in sort of not counting several times the same activities. We have, I would say, another challenge that we have today is the volume of data. There's so many activities, there's so much going on. And of course, what we do need to have in a statistical framework is quality assurance processes. For many years, we have been doing this kind of reviewing project descriptions one by one, making sure that those descriptions, well, that the taxonomies that are being used in the database actually reflect appropriately the descriptions of those activities. But today there's like, hundreds of thousands of activities to go through, and obviously initiatives like TOSSD, we have quite little human resources. So we do need to, for example, think about how artificial intelligence can help us to do some of the first screening of the data. And we've developed such a tool for the SDGs. So that's maybe another just thought there, how to manage with large volumes of data. So then the next slide, please. So here I asked a colleague yesterday to produce a slide just on the SDG 2. Indeed, I think this was mentioned in the introduction actually. So as support or targeting SDG 2, it is not only happening in the agricultural sector. So here you see what other what activities in other economic or social sectors have been reported as targeting SDG 2 in the TOSSD framework. So humanitarian aid is a large part of it, but then you see also activities, for example, in the health sector. Maybe there are some nutrition activities that have been included there that clearly target SDG 2. So this is another way of looking at the data, and I would say from my experience when doing analysis on specific themes, one needs to look at both the sectors and the SDG dimension. Then if we go to the next slide, please. So this is a complicated slide, but I did want to show it to you because I was asked to speak about challenges or problems in data collection. One of the important aspects of data is to know what exactly are we measuring, and at what point in time are we capturing a certain financial flow. And what you see on this slide is that, if you like, in the OECD statistics on financing for development, what is being measured is the donor effort. ODA is a measure of donor effort, and if you like, that's a first point of measurement where one can easily capture financing for development expenditures. Now in TOSSD, we have implemented another point of measurement because we want to get to this as accurate picture as possible of what flows to the recipient countries. And the difference there is that in TOSSD, actually the data on multilateral operations are collected directly from the multilateral organizations. The idea there being that then we have more accurate information is on what is actually coming to the country level. So trust funds is a good example of this. So what you see, if you measure donor effort, it is the contribution to a certain trust fund that the provider is making. But that is often at quite high level. You don't necessarily see the recipient breakdown of the operations or the sectoral breakdown of the operations. So measuring those financial flows at the recipient perspective point results in more accurate information. And again, in international discussions on financing for development, there is often a bit of a confusion, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about the donor contributions, or are we talking about what is actually being provided at the country level? So that is another challenge, I would say, that is good to bear in mind. The next slide, please. So here what we demonstrate is then how in the recipient perspective, so this is a couple of screenshots from the TOSSD online system, and I'm doing a little bit of marketing of our, our system, so I hope you excuse me for that. But what I wanted to point out here is that our understanding is that from the recipient perspective, it is good for them to see actually both the official support that they receive, but then also the private finance mobilized in the same framework, if you like. So that is what is shown here for Cameroon, for example, on the left-hand side. And there is a couple of other countries on the right-hand side showing also how one can do trend analysis on both official support and mobilization. And then there's still another slide kind of demonstrating this issue of donor effort and recipient receipts, if you like. So sorry, here I haven't translated the activities on this slide, but this is simply a kind of an illustration of what I said previously. You know, if we go to the multilateral organizations to collect data on their outflows to developing countries, then actually we see a more detailed picture on what is happening at the country level. And here, just to draw your attention to the fact that, so TOSSD, we are now collecting data from a number of South-South cooperation providers, and it's kind of one of the areas where I feel we should be really grateful of this progress made, like countries Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia are now providing data on their South-South cooperation activities, and that can be included in the same framework for analysis at the country level. So then what is next in the, I think there's a couple of slides left. So in the invitation for me to speak, there was this aspect about readiness of the international community to measure and monitor financing for SDGs. And there I think I have 3 slides. And the first one is about, you know, my appreciation of what is happening or what has happened over the last couple of years. So there is certainly a interest today by emerging countries to also provide information on the development cooperation activities that they undertake with other developing countries. And there are also multilateral organizations that have been created in the Global South that have the same kind of interest in telling the world what they are doing. Now, many of these countries would not want to be part of the official development assistance framework. I mean, that's something I know because I've been working in that area for many, many years. But what we are telling on this slide is our understanding on why in TOSSD we have actually managed to bring on board some of these emerging providers. So what are the key points here? It is the open, inclusive and transparent discussions on measurement. So we have been doing this in an international task force that developed the TOSSD framework. Today, this inclusivity is formalized in the International Forum on TOSSD. And this is a critical aspect, I think, in the measurement discussions. It cannot be just by a small group of providers. It needs to be inclusive, and the recipients will also need to be around the table. The same applies for multilateral organizations. The focus on cross-border flows, that is one of the elements why emerging countries have felt comfortable with reporting information on their activities. And then, if you like, this global public goods aspect, which is a little bit sensitive in the international discussions on financing for development, that is presented separately. So this is something that has enabled us to take forward the data issues. Then there's another aspect, which is, do we produce aggregates by provider? If you like, in the older world, if I may call it like this, there are specific targets for ODA, and there are rankings by donor who has achieved the target, who has not, who are the largest providers, etc. When we look at development finance in a broader perspective, we should not produce rankings. I mean, we can do aggregates on demand.
Julia,
but,
I might just ask you to
yes.
wrap up a little bit quickly,
Yes.
so we've got some time for discussion.
Okay, very good.
Super interesting, though. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine. So just to say the two other things. So use of UN definitions when possible. That is very important for emerging providers. And then just to mention that we closely collaborate with UNCTAD in the TOSTI context. So if you like, I mean, we can skip the other last two slides. There's a picture of the inclusive governance aspect, but I already talked about that. And then there's another slide with a beautiful picture on international public goods. I hope this is a little bit, addresses your request for highlighting some of the challenges of data, and happy to respond to any questions. And I hope I wasn't too long, and great to see you, Nadine, after a long time. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Julie. No, that was super interesting. I think really good context for us to understand. I think we can come back and discuss a little bit more with you after we've heard from Nadine and Chris. I guess one of the questions maybe for you to think about while we're hearing from Nadine and Chris is the capability of the system to disaggregate by sort of a food systems or rural development perspective, but maybe we can come back to that. So I think we go over to you, Nadine, to give us an introduction, and then supported by Chris. And it's the free FSI initiative. And I think Nadine will explain what the 3 is all about in her presentation. So over to you, Nadine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, and good morning, Jim, and good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me, and I hope you can see my screen. Can you see my screen? Can you confirm?
Not in presentation mode, Nadine.
Yep.
Yes, I'm doing just that.
Yeah, perfect.
Yep.
Sorry,
that's working now. Thanks, Nadine.
Okay, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Julia. And I think, Jim, as you are well aware, I think we'll be able to respond to your concern or your questions as to whether we can actually use the system, the OECD system, to track financial flows to food systems. And the answer is yes, because we've been working with them on this. So the starting point, just as I always like to put things in context, the financing agenda for food system transformation, and that the least developed countries, I mean, UNCTAD just released a study last year saying that the 48 least developed countries are the most challenged to finance their food system transformation, and that there says that it would take about 40% of the GDP to 2030 to achieve the national pathway for food system transformation. So we just see the magnitude of financing that would be required for these countries, knowing that they're the most impacted by the food system challenge today. I won't take you through this because you know it as well as I do. We had come to you before, Chris and I think, Chris, if I'm not mistaken, it was about a year ago, or maybe you have a better memory, to tell you that IFAD and the World Bank together had taken the responsibility of co-leading the financing agenda for food system transformation in the context of the Food System Summit follow-up. And the next Food System Summit should be in September next year. And we are doing that in collaboration with the Hub. What are we doing as the co-leads of the financing agenda for food system transformation? Just as a reminder, basically the development community and the partner countries have called for scaling up long-term development financing to food systems. The second thing is, Julia was talking about it, concessional financing, ODA, is essential because even with bold domestic resource mobilization, as I mentioned, the level of the magnitude of financing required from developing countries, the domestic resources are just not enough. And in the tight fiscal context, there's a lot of emphasis on concessional funding and operational support from the different financial institutions and bilateral donors. There's also a call for, and this is really a call to MDBs and IFAD for more flexible lending rates, increasing borrowing limits and increasing disbursement, and of course, mobilizing private sector and innovating financing source, because there's only so much the domestic resources and the development assistance can do. Basically, we had told you about a year ago that we will be working, IFAD and the World Bank, on evidence on financial flows to food systems for two reasons. Number one, to measure the progress of the countries, the private sector, the development community in mobilizing financial flows to food systems. We need data, we need evidence, we need a baseline. And secondly, as financial institution, we know that in order to target investment, there's a need for information on financial flow to food systems. I mean, we always put it in a simple sentence. If nobody knows how much is going to food system, where the money is going, to which part of the food system it is going, to which country is it targeting, it's not possible to basically repurpose, if I can say, the money to the areas of greater needs. So the challenge we committed to address, if you recall, is that there is no evidence today on financing to food systems. Our objective, working together, IFAD and the World Bank, was to set up a methodology to keep track of financial flows to food systems. The key value is to provide a harmonized approach to partner countries, development partners, and also the civil society to have a comparable approach to look at financial flows to food systems, making sure that it will be simple to understand. Decision makers don't like big Excel table and data, and that the data will be comparable over the years so that we can assess the progress. I'm happy to report to you that from the very preliminary information we shared with you at your last meeting, AGA, we have really gone beyond, and we have now what we call the 3FS. It's a tool to track financial flows to food system, and you see here 3F and 1S, so this is why we call it this way. The development was called by IFAD and the World Bank, and together with the hub, which the Food System Coordination Hub, which, as you know, has the responsibility for the follow-up to the Food System Summit. What we had told you before is that we would not reinvent the wheel. We have an ecosystem of support with expertise, instrument, outreach. So we worked with Julia, OECD, with DCD, the Development Cooperation Directorate, and also the Directorate on Agriculture and Trade. We work with GAIN, we work with FAO, we work with ICA, Academia 2063, which is leading the support to the African Union on the CADEP agenda. McKinsey also supported with some consultancy at some point. Sun was there on nutrition. AGRA, you know the role they play in Africa. We had the Good Food Finance Network advising us on some issue, and also the African Agricultural Transformation Initiative. And at different moments, different organizations also provided feedback and support. What did we do in terms of financing to food system transformation? We acknowledge, based on the SDG strategies, that these countries, developing countries, as recommended, need to mobilize and manage in a complementary manner 3 sources of financing. As I said, number one, domestic resource mobilization from fiscal revenue is still the first source of financing in many countries of development priorities. The second one is international development financing to complement domestic resource mobilization effort. As we know, in developing countries, and especially in LDCs, development financing is still an important source of financing to complement effort. And number 3, private sector financing. The ambition is that 50% of the SDG financing would come from the private sector. The story is not different for food system transformation. So ambition was really to allow the countries to look at, and their partners and civil society to look at these 3 sources of financing in complementarity when it comes to food system, taking a very simple approach. If you have a household, a husband and a wife, and let's say a child contributing to the budget, you want to look at who is paying what, who is contributing what in a complementary manner, not in isolated budget as it is the case at the moment. We also had to define, and we mentioned that to you, what do we look at? And this is what Julia was alluding at, also looking more at SDG 2, ending hunger. But what do we look at when we look at financing to food system? And this is the work we did with the different partners I mentioned to you. And in the case of development financing, we did with OECD, with FAO, and the different organizations I mentioned. We agreed that we will look at funding going to agriculture and value chain, the funding going to infrastructure for food system, the funding going to nutrition and health, social assistance, including food assistance, and also spending disbursement going to climate change and natural resources. Remember that the objective was to look at what part of the government budget is going there, what part of the development partners budget is going to these 5, what we call component, and the private sector. At the moment, we were able to develop the methodology for the domestic public financing and for basically the development financing, basically using the OECD CRS database and working with them on identifying the codes that would fall under these 5 components. And Chris will surely tell you that we are now moving into developing the private sector methodology. So we really took a gradual approach. Domestic covered, international development financing covered and piloted together with OECD, and now moving to the methodology on the private sector financing. To show you what we were able to do, what does it mean looking at the food system development financing? And we are very proud working with this big ecosystem of support that today we are able to look at how much development financing is going to food system, to what and where. And we call it a global report. I'm giving you a snapshot because as we speak, it's being peer reviewed, and we hope to release it very soon, at the latest at the beginning of the year, to serve as a baseline at the next Food Systems Summit, which should be around September. What are we able to look at? And I'm not going into the detail of the methodology, sorry. We can now see, again, and you see data accredited to OECD, we work with your team, Julia, that basically between 2018 and 2021, the power of the development financing that went to food system, and we are talking of ODA, of non-concessional financing and philanthropies, increased by 14% from 2018 to 2021 and stand at about 60.6 billion today. So that's a part of the development financing that is assessed as going to food systems. We are also able through this system to look at what is the distribution of the food development financing to food systems across the 5 components I told you about. Some call them components buckets, but we can see that 32%, about 1/3 of the international development financing to food system is going to social assistance, including food assistance. We are talking of cash transfer. We are talking of food assistance of different schemes to support the most vulnerable. So we can see that a lot is going to short-term support. 27% agricultural development and value chain, 17% to climate change, 17% to infrastructure to food system, and 7% to nutrition. There's some caveat in these figures, but let me not go to the detail to say this is kind of an aggregated picture of the way the development assistance is being distributed when it comes to food systems today. Again, I mentioned it looks at bilateral, multilateral, and philanthropies. We are also through this system able to see, and this is not for competition purpose, but to see who are the key players in the food system financing, who are the biggest bilateral, and the United States lead in the bilateral financing to food system, followed by Germany, France, and Japan. So we see that if I can say 5 to 6 donors really dominate the landscape bilateral in terms of food system financing. Interestingly, the United States is more focused on food assistance, while Germany put much more emphasis on agriculture. In the multilaterals, we have the World Bank Group, followed by the EU.
Nadine, I might just ask if you could keep your presentation to about another 5 minutes, if that's okay.
Yes, I will do that. And then the philanthropic donors, we have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is basically the biggest donors into this area. And this is, Jim, to give you exactly what you asked for, a bit of a presentation of what is happening. We can also, based on the data, look at the distribution. You see that's Sub-Sahara or Sub-Saharan Africa, you see on the left, receive about 1/3 of the funding going to food system, and you see the evolution here. I would just say that we can bring this information to the country level, and we have the example of Niger, really drilling down, where you see here, Niger, we work with the government of Niger to see what they do with the domestic financing, the amount. You see an increase of 70%. They can also see how they are distributing their own domestic resources. I mean, I'm just letting you look at the picture, but Niger, we thought it would be put on emergency, but very much on agriculture. Let me move to that. We are also looking at how the development partners are supporting Niger. Niger domestic increase of 70%, but 9% increase of ODA going to Niger. You can see here the ODA to Niger, basically also a focus on agriculture, but a larger part going to social assistance. So that's what we can do. And let me move. And also here, Niger specifically can look at basically who are the top bilateral partners to have dialogue with them, and who are the top multilateral partner. Jim, let me stop there by saying that what we are being asked now is basically, let me move on this because we don't have the time, to take a deep dive on what the IFI are doing. And we are basically working within this data with the Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, Inter-American, EBRD, World Bank, and IFAD to see specifically how the IFI are supporting this, because they represent about 1/3 of the development financing. And finally, working for the Food System Summit to look at what we call game changing. What is this money doing at the country level? Can we demonstrate that it's bringing change, that we can learn and exchange on this, and at the same time working on the private sector window? I hope I have stayed within the 5 minutes you've just given me, Jim, and I'm stopping there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Nadine. Super interesting. Chris, would you like to sort of just jump in to add anything to what Nadine's...
Well, I mean, basically, it was great to be with everyone yesterday in person, and I apologize I'm not there today. But just to turn around and say, I mean, this tool is really highlighting the word transformation is way beyond our thinking. You know, we are still focusing very much on food security, emergency payments, and so on. So the biggest concern we have globally is really the long-term investment requirements in the food system. That's number one. And my second point, I mean, Nadine has covered so much, and I don't want to go on too long, but what we really are working on now very hard is developing a methodology to try and analyze the private sector flows into the food system, because we're talking about a lot in the conference there, in the event, about the role of the private sector. And I think this is really important if we can put numbers around it. So obviously the methodology is very hard to develop. We're working on it at the moment between the World Bank and IFAD and other partners. So we're hoping to launch that in the next few months and then start applying it to the global scene as well as the countries that we've already started initiating on. But coming out to the summit next year, I think we really want to highlight to the ODA sector, you know, where the financing is, and taking some of the country examples. We're going to be applying the tool now to another 11 or 12 countries in partnership with GAIN and SUN. So a lot happening in this space, and I'm really proud for the development of the 3FS, and it's been a great collaboration between the World Bank Group and IFAD and others. But back to you, Jim.
Great, thanks, Chris. So Look, let's open up to any questions or comments in the audience here, but also online. If anybody online would like to post questions, do so. And perhaps while people here are getting their brains going on what they might like to ask, just perhaps back to all three of you. I mean, what's something in looking at this data that's really surprising you? And then in line, have we got any questions here from the audience? But maybe Julia, Nadine, Chris, what in looking at all of this data and pulling it together again, what things are perhaps really surprising you when you start looking at the data?
Well, I just spoke. I mean, obviously, I'll just reiterate that point of transformation. It's not happening. It can't happen without more money. And also, when it comes to global aid, ODA, I mean, we've got to look at really scaling up these resources and be more targeted. And the thing about the 3FS tool, it creates a very, very good debate and conversation about linking finance to policy, which is a very special interest to the World Bank, as a lot of people know. So I just want to highlight that point. So back to you, Jim. I see there's a hand up.
Great. Torhere, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you so much. I think this is very interesting. I'm Torero from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway, Special Representative for Food Security. Just because I saw your statistics here and showing that which Nadine, those countries that are high on assistance to food systems transformation. But I didn't see Norway, but I will not complain about that. But the reason why I'm asking is that what is not here? What will be taken out of this statistics?
Sorry,
I
do you
didn't understand
the question, Nadine?
No.
Maybe just rephrase the question for us, Torhere.
Yes, yeah, I can do it. Try one more time here. The reason why I'm asking is that I know for sure that we, from our side, we have very big donations for food security in overall. That includes, for instance, the humanitarian side, and it's a lot of different agriculture projects and so on. But in your statistics, we're quite low. So that means something when it comes to food security is not there in your statistics. And my question to you is, what would that be? What will be included in your statistics? I'm just curious.
Did you understand that now, Nadine?
Yes, I understand very well, and I mean, this is the kind of question that we get and that we don't like, because every donor wants to see themselves and believe they are big in the landscape. You have the whole list of donors. It's here for sake of presentation. We have just put a few. I think we have just put 10, and then you have the ranking of all of them, and it's very simple. It's whatever your government is reporting to OECD. This is the OECD data. Now, if you want to see what is in every specific bucket, the codes we have taken are the codes related to agriculture, as I mentioned. So basically, what bilateral and multilateral donors report according to the agriculture and value chain sector. The second thing in nutrition also. The other thing is on climate change, environment, and natural resources, and also on the what is called food assistance, school canteen, and things like this. So it's a selection of codes, and that relate to these different buckets that took a lot of arbitrage, because this is where, as I said, which code do we take for nutrition? We worked a lot with SUN. Which codes do we take for agriculture? We align with FAO methodology. For agriculture and infrastructure. For nutrition, it was SUN. On social assistance, it was the World Bank methodology of Aspire. So when I say that we didn't want one, well, because you ask these kind of questions, what do we take? And we didn't want to be partial in the sense that it's not Chris and I who chose. We align with leading methodologies in this area and leading institution, meaning FAO, SUN on the nutrition budgeting, FAO on agriculture, World Bank on social assistance methodology. And this is where it comes from. So the data is the data reported by the government to the OECD database.
Great. Thanks, Nadine. So Torhere, I mean, maybe that's also, you can follow up sort of bilaterally if you feel that something's not aligning there. Julia, do you want to come into this discussion, and then I'll ask for a comment in the audience here?
Yes, so maybe just an additional point. So, I mean, where do the data come from? They are actually the data that are being stored in Norway's own internal reporting system. This is the way it functions in practice. So countries have their internal databases where they then classify the activities following the various reporting directives that we have established at the OECD. Just to let you know that when it comes to the sector codes, the SDG tagging, so the TOSD framework is aligned with the codes of the OECD, so it kind of the same codes can be used in both cases. But then, of course, there's always subjectivity about, well, do I record this activity under that or another code, and sometimes things can go wrong. And for that reason, it's quite important that there is a quality assurance that is happening at the sort of international level. So that's what the OECD Secretariat and TOSD Secretariat are doing. But then also in these kind of analytical exercises, so if you find that there's something which looks odd for Norway, so then please get in touch and we look into the data and see if something needs to be corrected. And maybe just an additional point, one also needs to have that kind of an analysis at the country level, because, you know, as I was explaining, you know, there are lots of steps in the data flow, and when we get to presenting what is actually being received by a developing country at the country level, it might look, you know, not actually accurate. So there's another way of addressing the kind of the coding issue, but at the same time selecting those couple of codes, that is the only practical, pragmatic way that you can do this type of, exercises.
Great. Thanks,
Thank you.
Julia. I think we're getting close to time here. Maybe we just take another question or comment here in the audience, and then we might need to think about wrapping up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Hendrik Denker from the German Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, the BMZ. And let me first say thank you very much for this super interesting presentation and the case that you presented. Very important, I think. Now, I would like to second my colleague from Finland, he was, I believe, who was speaking, no, Norway, sorry, it's Norway, and that I am also a bit surprised about the numbers presented. Well, Germany was featured well here, so thank you for that, but the number is different to the numbers that we normally work with, and this brings me to my first question, which is, does this really contribute coherence to the system of statistics and numbers, where there are so many out there on food security and on donor spending and all that? Is it just another number, or is it a number that is better than the others and that will probably replace the others by time? So that is the one question. The other is, you say there are 12 countries that are covered. How much does it cost to cover a country? And what are you aiming for? How many more countries do you want to cover until the UNFSS and beyond? And the last question, I think the numbers that are presented are only as good as they are able to steer a policy discussion in a country on priorities and on what's going on. Now, how do you foresee this to happen? And will we see a discussion, for instance, at the stock-taking event next year that is based on these figures? And in what way, what kind of discourses can we expect, and what kind of lessons can we expect coming out of this? Thank you.
Great, thanks. I mean, I think you've maybe given us another half hour of discussion there. So I'm going to ask Julia and Chris and Nadine just to give us a very, very quick response to those three questions.
Shall I go first?
Yep.
Yes, okay. So coherence is important. At the same time, I would say there are so many different needs to present data on financing for development that not everything can be coherent. But in my mind, it is good to have initiatives like the three Fs because they put the spotlight in one aspect of development cooperation, and then what is needed is at the global level to have kind of an umbrella to make sure it all makes sense if you look at the bits and pieces. I would want to comment on the steering policy discussion in countries. I think that is a super important aspect, and that is the one that we are really promoting also in the International Forum on TOSSD, because there is a need to be able to relate the statistics that are produced at the international level to the national development strategies of the countries. For example, have them contribute to the the INFFs, the financing frameworks at the national level. And at the same time, I reckon that kind of the hard job of data collection, it needs to be done by organizations like ours to not put the burden of the data collection, collation, quality assurance to the recipient countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Very quick last comment, Chris, from either you or Nadine, and then I think we need to wrap up. Maybe particularly on how this is going to be used at the country level to open up dialogues about expenditure.
I'll just give a very quick summary. I mean, from our German colleague there, it's a very important conversation. We are being I'm going to use the word demand-led. We got many countries asking us to apply this tool as part of working with the Ministry of Finance and the associated ministries around the food system. It's not about agriculture only; it's about Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Infrastructure, etc., and so on, and also trade, commerce, industries, investment. Yeah. So what's really important is looking at across the food system. The Ministry of Finances that are looking at this, they want to support their budgetary allocation processes. They want to create interesting, policy conversation internally on how they realign and reset. And also we've got the post-Malibu agenda, coming out. And it's going to be very important to put numbers around that post-Malibu agenda. So things like the 3FS, we're trying to be robust in our methodology. We want to be comparable across countries. So when we say Niger is spending this and Kenya is spending that, we want to be able to show people that the methodology has been applied. So at country level, I think it's very healthy and a healthy conversation. We've done 3 very strong pilots. We've got 12 countries or so in our pipeline. Yeah. And the question there from Germany on how much, I'm going to say it's around about $100,000, but that's still to be determined per country. And it can take 3 to 4 months, even longer, depending on how long or how willing the country is to participate and data access and so on. That's country level, but then we've got the IFI level and then we've got the ODA level. So great. I'll stop there. Thanks, Jim.
Great, thanks, Chris. Nadine, any last quick comment from you before we wrap up?
Yeah, I have 3 points. I would respond yes.
Quickly, please.
Yes, well, otherwise I can also wrap up now if you prefer.
No, I want to hear from you, but just briefly. Thank you.
Okay, so I would say yes, there is coherence. It's just that people have to become familiar with the different concept. Why you have different figures is that some figures, if I take, for example, the Global Alliance for Food Security looks at food security. For example, you also have the SOFI report, which look also at another dimension of food security and taking more information than the others. This one is taking a food system approach, which goes beyond food security to include climate, to include nutrition, etc. So it's about becoming familiar with different concepts, like you talk about undernourishment or nutrition or hunger. We are talking of different concepts people need to be familiar with, but you will see that when we compare them, there is coherence. The second thing is to steer the policy discussion. Yes, I confirm. It will be very interesting for you, for example, to engage with the government of Niger on this, and you will see how they started discussion, because they realized that they had very little money going to climate, while it's the top priority on the national pathway, and it's less than 4%, I think, of the development financing going to climate. So it triggered a budget discussion at the national level. And how many countries there should be as many countries as possible. I mean, I have Julia here, and basically, in order to have good policies, OECD says you need data and evidence. And if the countries don't have data and evidence on where their financing is going, how can they target? How can they make decision on where are the gaps and the need? So, Julia, I was an OECD person, and we say evidence for better policies and better lives. So I hope all the countries in the world will be able to do this. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Chris, Nadine, and Julia. That was super interesting. I think super valuable part of the discussions we had from yesterday. And I think the exciting part about going forward, if I understand it, is that the next phase will be really trying to look in much more detail at the private sector flows into this, which I understand is probably a little bit more challenging. But I think we all look forward to seeing that data as well as it comes online. So again, thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause for their input this morning, even if online. So. And we look forward to seeing the report that's coming out early next year. So again, thank you very much. And I think I hand back to you, Henry.
Thank you very much indeed, Jim. Thanks to you and the panelists. I mean, my head was hurting by the end of that. I remember when the TOS-D, as it was called back in 2015, was launched by Angel Gurria. This very powerful, dominant former Mexican foreign minister. And people said, what on earth does this mean? It's 9 years old now. We can see that it's having real world impacts. And that example given by Nadine was pretty powerful. So our government is getting all these inflows, but he's not quite sure what's going where. That's a national government. So, I mean, oh my God. And if as a result of these metrics and this system, they're getting clarity, they can rebalance things and work on the priorities. Because in the end, we're talking about ownership at the national level and not just from the donors. So that was very important. I thought it was a very good example at the end there of that session. So thanks very much to Jim and the team. Now, okay, we're running a little bit behind, but we're still going to devote an hour and 15 minutes to our next session, which is the thematic working group, and it's by the Global Donor Working Group on Land, and the subheading is Redefining and Enhancing the Quality of Finance for Sustainable Development, how to better reach indigenous peoples and local communities. And it kind of plays into the discussions we had with the young entrepreneurs, the agripreneurs yesterday, even though they don't necessarily fall into this category, but there is an overlap. So let me invite the panelists. Some are in person and some are virtual on the line. Let me invite the in-person participants first of all. So Ward Ansia, I saw Ward earlier. He said he's feeling very happy. The FAO people are treating me well, so he's in good form and he's ready to engage and to be dynamic. So Ward, thank you very much. And Ward leads the land tenure team at FAO. Also here in person is Margarita Lodoni, who's a technical specialist at IFAD working on indigenous peoples. Margarita, welcome to you. Thank you very much indeed. And also in person, we have Christina Timponi Kambiaji, who is a senior global policy and advocacy specialist at the International Land Coalition. You're standing in for Michael Taylor, who I think has been summoned to Brussels. I think he's in Brussels. I think he's meeting his new president. There's big things happening in Botswana. I think they've had their first change of government in terms of party in 58 years since independence from the British. Yes, very much so, from the British. Right. Why am I adopting that accent? Anyway, who knows? Okay, and now on the line, we have from the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, we have Chris Penrose Buckley. Chris is the land policy lead at the FCDO, and Jenny Lopez, who is a land governance advisor. Chris and Jenny, can you make yourselves known? Can we see you? Maybe we'll do it all together. Ah, yes, there we are. There's Jenny. I see Jenny. Hello to you. And Chris as well. I'm sure there'll be a split screen. We'll see Chris. Let me introduce Birgitta Firing, who is an independent consultant at the Christensen Fund. Welcome to you, Birgitta. Thank you very much indeed. And also joining us virtually is Basiru Isa, who is with the Network of Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities for the Sustainable Management of Forest Ecosystems in Central Africa. Basiru, hello to you. There you are. Very good. Excellent. Okay. Hello to you. Fantastic. I'm going to sit down. One, two. No? No. Aha, yes. And there was sound. Established. Bit of German there for our German friends in the audience, yeah. Grüß Gott. Wie geht's? Ganz gut. A feeling kind of international today. Wonderful. Okay, so we're going to have a really good, engaging, and dynamic session. Let's think initially why we're doing this. We talk a lot about aligning, redefining, catalyzing, etc. But that's no good. These are just fine words if in the end they're not reaching the custodians of the land, the people with the land forest knowledge, the people whose traditional methods of farming, agriculture, looking after the natural flora and fauna is often ignored, but actually it should be valued. And this is the kind of thing we say here. And sometimes when those people are in the room, we say, yes, we value you, we respect you, but then things carry on as usual. Perhaps, hopefully, we now understand we have to bridge that gap. We have to not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. And I'm sure some of our delegates, our participants watching us online will have views on this, so please do send in your thoughts and your questions. I want to start off with Jenny. I understand Chris won't be with us. Jenny, you're flying solo for the FCDO. First of all, can you give us some details on the Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities Forest Tenure Pledge, what it entails, how it was done, and you know, what the main challenges are. And if it's successful, do tell us. So let's start off with you.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome and for the, it's an honour to be here today. So welcome as well to everyone in the room. Thank you for listening. We did have a presentation. I'm not sure if it's able to be shown, if that's helpful to those in the room. Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I'm here speaking on behalf of the UK, but also I'm a member of the Pledge Donor Working Group, so also speaking on behalf of other donors who are part of the IPLC Forest Tenure Pledge. And the title of the presentation is Scaling Support for Forest Tenure Rights, which is really the core focus of why many of us, not just the donors, but also Indigenous people, local community leadership, many civil society organisations, and also combination of many different stakeholders came together at COP26 to really put effort on how we could scale up support for tenure rights. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. First, just to recap, why does land and forest tenure matter? Just some quick facts I'll go through. Indigenous peoples represent over 6% of the world's population. I think that's probably, we don't realise how large across the world communities are made up of those who have history and a long history and heritage of living on the land, living in forests in that way. Indigenous peoples and local communities, we call them IPLCs, so forgive that if you can keep that abbreviation in mind as we go through. They manage and live in at least half of the world's land, which is huge. And of course, if we think of all the ecosystems, biodiversity, habitats that entails, they really are guardians, custodians of much of those ecosystems and protected forests, protected habitats, including a third of intact forests. However, the rights of IP and LCs are protected in just 10% of the land in which they reside. So this really results in a lot of insecurity, a lot of feeling that they could be moved, their livelihoods aren't protected, their homes aren't protected, families aren't protected. Over 1 billion people worldwide feel insecure about their rights to property or land. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Just before COP26, there was quite startling research that emerged showing in 2020 showed that less than 1% of overseas development assistance for climate mitigation and adaptation was going to forest tenure rights and forest management. I think it was, for many of us, a lot smaller figure than we had realised. And furthermore, even smaller share of that is reaching Indigenous people and local community-led organisations directly. So that's less than 1% of the 1% of ODA for climate mitigation adaptation is reaching IPLCs. This really demonstrated that global donor funding systems, and particularly for bilateral donors, were really not set up to enable more direct support to IPLCs. Can we have the next slide, please? So the Forest Tenure Pledge, which was launched at COP26, brought together 23, now 25, public and private donors who committed a really historic amount of $1.7 billion towards advancing forest tenure rights in ODA eligible countries. This was made up of individual donor commitments. It's not a pooled fund. The spend and accountability is individual. There is no central funding allocation mechanism. That really gives a lot of freedom to the individual donors to focus on their priority areas. And of course, across the range of donors we have as a part of the pledge, from the bilateral to philanthropic private donors, there really is a big range in terms of focal countries, focus areas, and this really allows that flexibility and freedom without setting up further intermediary bodies to manage a pooled fund. So that's worked really effectively. A donor coordination group was established straight away. This is called the Forest Tenure Funders Group, and this really allows for facilitation of coordination between donors, collaboration opportunities that could be on a focus theme such as women and gender, or it could be in a particular region. And also, really critically, facilitating greater dialogue between the donor community and Indigenous peoples and local community-led organisations, which Birgit will speak to later and has been really key in organising many of those dialogues. If we could have the next slide, please. So really, in terms of what the priority was for the pledge, as well as really raise that visibility and momentum about this agenda and really get that on the global stage at COP26, which was quite historic. We had an Indigenous leadership on stage with government leadership from donor community and tropical forest country governments. That was a really historic moment, and we really are very committed to maintaining that momentum and visibility. In terms of the priority shifts in what we're trying to do within the pledge, it is a key part is channeling more direct support to Indigenous people and local communities. And you'll see I put the word direct here in some inverted commas, because as well as having that really direct from donor to Indigenous community organisations, there's also accepted that it's channeling more directly. There's certain situations where we do need to work through intermediaries, but it's about ensuring that the Indigenous people and local community organisations have greater control in how those programmes are designed and how funds are spent. So it's ensuring that a greater percentage is reaching communities more directly. It's also about working with trusted partners. So where those intermediaries are needed, making sure these partnerships are more inclusive and more collaborative, and IPLCs are more involved and have decisions in who those partners are and the way they're working together. It's about increased investment in capacity building of IPLC organisations. And when we say capacity building, that's in the ways that IPLCs, how they choose to be, where they identify that should happen, where they would like to see that happen, rather than that being dictated where donors would like to see that or assume that. And that can really be in ways that IPLC organisations are empowered, that they're able to get that funding at scale. That's what we're working towards, is that we can cut out many of those intermediaries in a longer term, and that IPLCs have those the capacities that they want to see to manage funds more directly themselves. It's very much about, as well as the money and the finances, it's also about policy shifts within funder organizations. So within each of our own bodies, each of our own organizations, there's policy shifts that we can be making. That's part of what we're committed to as donors. Where can we be raising the agenda within our own organizations? Where can we make sure that the IPLC agenda on forest tenure is embedded within a much wider range of programming that may typically be seen, where there's policy or negotiation text happening, such as we've seen recently in Climate Biodiversity COP or the UNFC CEC COP. Where can we make sure that there is more strategic focus and within our organizations more program focus more generally? So as well as the spend, there's also very much the policy and the wider, I guess, visibility and awareness of how it needs to be embedded throughout the work we're doing and how we can raise the profile of that. Next slide, please. So the donor ambitions really is to get increased global attention on IPLC tenure rights, mobilise more direct resources to support IPLC secure their tenure rights, more effective funding mechanisms, better coordination between the donors, civil society activities, really getting better collaboration and shifting that political will for action, not just within the donor governments, but also getting that dialogue with tropical forest country governments as well, and really getting that shared agenda. Next slide, please. The types of projects funded by the through the pledge, I guess we really also want to emphasize it's at different tiers, different levels. So as well as that direct support to IPLC organizations, which you'll see on the right, which includes things such as the local mapping initiatives, tenure registration, really building that capacity for new funding mechanisms so that IPLCs can afford the funding, absorb funding more directly, work on sustainable livelihoods, and really that funding on the ground is part of the funding, but also support and funding going to more regional level support structures such as regional local governments, how they're supporting those communities on the ground, regional organisation and network strengthening, which is, I guess, bringing together a much larger group of IPLCs and, I guess, shifting how they can influence political changes, shifts that's happening at regional level, but also there's the work happening at the more systemic level on land and forest tenure reforms. So this is something in particular, some donors such as the UK, other bilaterals, as well as that direct support on the ground, a key focus of work such as the UK is working on capacity building to tropical forest country governments on how, like administration capacity, how they can be taking forward, developing, advancing and implementing that reform level change on land governance to really enable that work on the ground as well, but also make sure that those processes are happening in a way that's more inclusive of communities on the ground. So I think part of what we're trying to achieve through the pledge and that collaboration is how we can better join up those three different levels of funding to make sure that they're happening more effectively together, particularly at regional level. Next slide, please. Just to touch on some of those challenges, which it's helpful to keep in mind, and I particularly speak here as a bilateral donor, is it's not always, and this is part of what we're really trying to address through the pledge. This is the shift that needs to happen. For a bilateral donor, funding multiple individual projects means very high project management costs and also less likelihood of projects getting approved. So there is very inflexible internal due diligence processes, risk management process and reporting requirements, which are very much designed for larger programs. This prevents a lot of barriers if we were to fund IPLC-led organisations individually, directly. This is why we've ended up in the situation where we typically work through trusted intermediary organisations who manage those multiple direct grants on our behalf, and sometimes this can function effectively. It can reduce administration and reporting burdens, and increasingly what some of us donors are looking to do is find those trusted intermediaries who work very closely with IPLC-led organisations, who are ones that we can, I guess, have the confidence and work very closely with to ensure a much greater share is reaching IPLC communities, but at the same time they're providing that technical support to IPLC partners to, as we mentioned earlier, ensure that their capacity is building to the point where in future funding mechanisms which are being established by IPLCs, there is that potential to be funded directly by bilateral partners. But I think what we're saying is there's that intermediary stage at the moment where for bilaterals the challenges mean we are still in many cases needing to work through intermediaries, but that's something which very actively being tackled, and that's where the philanthropic organisations often have a lot more flexibility, and they can fund different stages of different types of programmes, more innovative programmes, and this can often set that enabling foundations for bilaterals to come in at later stages. So I think we're also mindful of different strengths of where donors are able to fund things in different ways, different stages, different types of projects. But we'll emphasise that the part of the pledge commitment is exploring how this can change. There are exciting new examples emerging.
Hi, Jenny, I was waiting for a pause.
I'm on the last slide. Let's move on.
Because I need to ask you to land, because we do have about 5 other speakers. I want people to keep their presentations a bit shorter because we need to finish this session by 11:20.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Thanks for the prompt. Thank you. So just you asked me at the beginning, is this a success? So the latest report, which was published at COP 2 weeks ago, showed that donors have now dispersed nearly 79% of the total pledge target. This indicates the strong momentum towards achieving the full commitment by the end of 25. And what I'd really like to emphasise before I close here is around 55 million of that, so that's 10% of the total pledge funds, were now reported as reaching IPLC organisations directly. While this is still a very small amount, it's not good enough. We do want to just stress that is a significant increase from the 1% I mentioned earlier and the 2% showing last year. So just to end, that is positive change. The trend shows things are moving. The pledge is working in terms of really enhancing and moving forward that dialogue. So I'll end on that positive note, and just looking forward, just to say that discussions are underway on a second phase of the pledge. It's not finalised yet, but we're very much wanting to shape that with IPLC organisations, with tropical forest country governments, and we expect that to be launched at COP30 in Brazil.
Thank you very much indeed, Jenny. And you a lot of information there, and you ended on a positive note, which is excellent. And you threw forward to the second phase of the Forest Tenure Pledge. And let's ask Birgitte Feiring to pick up on that, because Birgitte, we want to know more about this second phase of the Forest Tenure Pledge. And I understand you've been facilitating a range of dialogues recently. So my question really is, why are you doing this? Why is there need for a second pledge? What is there to be achieved or done better if we want to better reach indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro descendants significantly under this second pledge? Please explain why.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you, although long distance. Would have loved to be in Rome, though. Anyway, the dialogues that I have been facilitating recently at COP16 in Cali were an initiative by some of the members of the Forest Tenure Funders Group that Jen just mentioned, to reach out to indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendants to have their input into this formulation process that is ongoing among the donors. So as such, I think this initiative is also a reflection of that deepened dialogue that the pledge has also caused, and which is very much appreciated among indigenous peoples and local communities. So just to say that we had this series of dialogue meetings. There's a draft report that is now sent out in consultation, for consultation with those who participated in Cali. It will be finalized and submitted to the Forest Tenure Funders Group in mid-December. So I can just give you the broad kind of headlines and main recommendations that came out in these consultations. And just to really emphasize, I'm not speaking on behalf of Indigenous peoples, local communities, or Afro-descendants here. I'm the classical intermediary who facilitated a process and is now kind of the messenger between different groups. So very happy that I will be followed by Basiro, who is a legitimate rights holder in this space. Just to say that a lot of what Jen said was echoed in the dialogues we had in Cali. There's a big appreciation of what the pledge has the impact the pledge has had, and that is in terms of increasing the focus on the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities as stewards, as custodians, as managers of crucial ecosystems. There's an acknowledgement that the pledge has generally increased funding to these groups, increased direct funding, although it still remained quite low, including considering that this is a pledge that is supposed to really support these groups. And importantly, I mean, the deepened dialogue was really mentioned as a main outcome of this phase of the pledge. And the overall recommendation going forward is that a new pledge must build on these results and continue, deepen, and strengthen this dialogue so that, we move towards a true partnership between very different partners who work towards shared objectives. So a lot of the operational recommendations that I will very quickly run you through are all meant to strengthen that partnership that the pledge has fostered so far. So the first set of recommendations has to do with coming up with a more inclusive pledge. The focus on forest, tropical forest, subtropical forest is correct, is understandable, is justified because of the role forests have, including in countering climate change. But a lot of ecosystems are interconnected or interdependent, and that also goes for Indigenous peoples and local communities, organizations, and networks. So there's a call for flexibility to allow support to also follow the identity lines of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and also include other crucial ecosystems while keeping a main focus on forests. There is a call to work more on the flexibility that Jen mentioned. To respect the priorities and limitations of individual donors. It's obvious that bilateral donors will focus on ODA-eligible countries, but philanthropies are able to go beyond. So to leave that flexibility and play on the complementarity of different kind of fundings, to be more inclusive, bring in also strong organizations from beyond ODA-eligible countries. And then an explicit call to include Afro-descendant peoples, which in the Latin American context is a very well-defined group of rights holders. They are collectivities that manage forest and other crucial ecosystems. So a call to also include Afro-descendants. The previous pledge is focusing on Indigenous peoples, which is also a well-defined group of rights holders, but also local communities. And there we have some kind of a challenge, because local communities, the term is often used in a very generic sense, but could also be used in a much more specific sense to talk about local communities that embody traditional lifestyles that are relevant for biodiversity conservation and sustainable development. So local communities are now in a process to come up with some identification criteria that would make it more explicit what local communities are we talking about. And there's a call for donors to support that process. Then, not surprisingly, there's a united call for more direct funding. We know that only a small portion has been dispersed directly, and that the trickle-down effect of money going through the intermediaries is not really happening at the scale that is needed. The Indigenous Peoples of Asia Solidarity Fund undertook a survey of more than 400 indigenous organizations in the Asia region across 13 countries. And this is the region that hosts 2/3 of the world's indigenous peoples. And of the 400 organizations, including all the major national organizations and networks, 15% were operating without any monetary budget. Another 40% had an annual budget below $5,000. And we could only identify 4 organizations in the region that had an annual budget above $1 million. The ratio of paid staff to unpaid staff was 1:16. So it's just zooming in on one region to maybe reflect a broader reality. So the request, I mean, I should say that this is not a discussion of money as such. This is a discussion about impact. The real risk here is that if money is not reaching, we are not able to have that impact in terms of combating climate change, protecting biodiversity, ensuring sustainable development. So the request for a new pledge is that a minimum of 25% of the funding would be provided as direct funding. We understand that this is a significant increase in a relatively short period of time, and that will require a lot of innovation and collaboration, as also mentioned by Jen, to rapidly change modalities and expand institutional capacities. So some of the actions that are recommended is to invest in the emerging funding mechanisms that are established by indigenous peoples and local communities themselves, to expand that support, to use, and I think you also mentioned that, Jen, to use the more flexible philanthropic funding to build up the necessary capacities to absorb larger grants, to document and scale up good practices of bilateral donors. And for example, we were so happy to find a brilliant example of Norwegian bilateral cooperation supporting directly indigenous peoples in the Brazilian Amazon. So we have annexed that example to say, hi, bilaterals, could you follow this example? Or could you even make such good examples into multi-donor initiatives? Acknowledge the added value of ownership of project proposals in competitive bidding processes. A lot of donors may call for proposals, and it's the non-indigenous or non-local community organizations that run with it because they have specialized staff to prepare the proposals. So could we give a comparative advantage to organizations that truly represent and work at the community level? And then where necessary or requested, transfer funds through trusted fiscal sponsors selected by indigenous peoples and local communities themselves, with transparency of contractual arrangements, etc., etc. I don't know how much more time I have, but I just wanted to touch.
If I could, the fact that you raised that question, Brigitte, invites me to ask you to land as soon as you can. Because,
okay, so let me just zoom in on another key recommendation, which is to clarify the roles and contributions of these so-called intermediaries. Because it's not just about the 25% of direct funding, it's also about the 75% of more direct, as Jen said. So how do we work in a rights-based manner that help balance those unequal power relations that are there? So a strong suggestion is to start with the language. Not all organizations are intermediaries. And it's such a all-encompassing term that, you know, it hides all the differences and nuances in this discussion. You cannot compare IFAD or the World Bank to a small national or local NGO. But right now, in the way we talk about it, they're all intermediaries. So there is a suggestion to come up with a more nuanced language about strategic alliance that may provide other kind of support, but not necessarily transfer of funds. Project partners that provide a full package of support, legal, policy-oriented communication, but also some transfer of funds, and intermediaries that are born with the purpose of transferring funds.
Okay.
And now I'm wrapping up. develop
you may
a
wrap up for
set
the
of
next 10 minutes, Brigitte.
criteria,
I need
a
to,
minimum standard,
Yep.
so that indigenous peoples, local communities could actually assess those and be involved in the selection. Because a trusted partner has to be trusted both ways, not just with donors, but also with indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descended. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Brigitte. Sorry to rush you at the end there, but I know what happens. I do these events all the time, and then at the end we have no time for questions and people have to rush at the end. So let's see if we can be lean and fit with our presentations. Margarita, hint, hint, onto you. Margarita Lodoni is with IFAD. And Margarita, IFAD has a program also to unlock funding opportunities for indigenous peoples. Please tell us a bit more about it and how it differs or complements the activities and practices we just heard about, because they're all going to be, how can I put it, critiqued, I think, by Basiru Issa, because in the end, he's going to be the arbiter of whether or not this is working. And so please bear that in mind. Over to you, Margarita.
Thank you. Really, I'm very happy to join this session. I'm representing the Indigenous Peoples team at IFAD. And yes, I will talk a little bit about the Indigenous People Assistance Facility, which is a mechanism established at IFAD in 2006. Before it was managed by the World Bank, and then it was transferred to IFAD. And it's a mechanism through which IFAD is channeling direct resources to indigenous peoples organizations. We are talking about small grants up to 70,000 USD, project up to 3 years. Since 2006, we were able to fund around 200 projects all over the world, meaning in the regions where IFAD operates, Asia and the Pacific, Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. But I want to say that actually since its establishment, IPAF has been evolving a lot. Because at the beginning it was managed directly by IFAD, so it was IFAD entering into agreement with all these small indigenous peoples organizations. But then in 2011, it was decided to decentralize the program. So now IPAF work in a way that IFAD channeled the resources to 3 indigenous peoples regional organization, one in Asia and the Pacific, one in Africa, and the other one in Latin America and the Caribbean. And then these 3 indigenous peoples organizations are the ones really managing these funds and channeling the resources to the awarded organization. In the ongoing cycle, we are supporting 53 organizations in the 3 regions. These 53 organizations are both indigenous peoples organizations, but in some cases, and I really thank Birgit for setting the scene for this conversation. In some cases, actually, the funds goes to NGO who applied on behalf of indigenous peoples organizations and communities, because of course we have some criteria, and not all that. For instance, one of the criteria is that an organization, to be able to apply, they have to be registered, and not all the indigenous peoples organizations are registered, just to give you an example. No? One of the mandatory requirements for IPAF is the free prior and informed consent from the community. No? So we have to have a kind of evidence that the project was designed by the indigenous peoples community. Now, IPAF, as I say, IPAF has been evolving. We started in 2006 with an amount of 700,000, and now the ongoing 6 IPAF cycle, we are it's about 6 million. So in terms of funding, we are growing. The resources are coming not only from IFAD, but also from donors. The ongoing cycle is being funded by SIDA, and also some funds from Packard Foundation and NORAD. Last year, we secured some funds for the next IPAF cycle, which started next year or beginning of 2026. And NORAD is interested in funding the IPAF in Africa. So we are now, let's say, exploring now also possibility for, let's say, we are mobilizing resources for covering the other region. But now I just wanted to focus on why IPAF is unique, no? Or which is the, let's say, uniqueness of EPAF in this wide landscape of funding. Let's say that EPAF is a self-driven mechanism, indigenous people self-driven, meaning that even if EPAF is hosted by IFAD, the way it is structured, no, shows really a strong commitment of IFAD in putting the indigenous peoples in the driving seat. Why? Because as I said, in 2011, EPAF was decentralized. So now we are channeling the resources directly to the 3 organizations, and then they rechannel the resources to the awarded organization. But also we have an EPAF board, which is composed by indigenous people's representative. And this means that both the technical review of the proposals and the final selection is not made by IFAD, but it's made by these 3 organizations hiring indigenous consultants to review the proposals, and then the EPAF board made the final selection of proposals to be approved and funded. So IFAD is, let's say, our role is as an EPAF secretariat now. So we are the one in charge of reporting and financial and legal reporting, internal reporting. Maybe something interesting to say here is that let's say that the fact that EPAF is hosted in IFAD by IFAD is also provide, let's say, an opportunity for these small projects to be linked to bigger projects. Now, you know, I mean, IFAD mainly work not through grants, but through loans. And in many cases, we are trying to see if there are linkages and possibility of linking these small project and organization to IFAD operation in the country. This happened, and it's like happening. We are now having a meeting with our IFAD country offices and these small project to see if there is, and which is, I mean, if there is room, no, for linkages. And these linkages might be in terms of institutional strengthening, might be, but it's, I would say, is a mutual learning, no? And it's a mutual institutional strengthening, because what IFAD is learning in hosting the EPAF is really how we can better engage with indigenous peoples, which are the priority, and also in terms of technical skill. Now, EPAF has a strong focus on climate and biodiversity. So we are really, let's say, learning a lot on how we can improve also the design of IFAD project now happening in areas which are home to indigenous peoples. And other interesting experiences in the past, some EPAF projects start to engage with IFAD in-country teams. And now some of these organizations who received funds, EPAF grants in the past, are now engaging with IFAD at country level and also providing technical advice on how to better support indigenous people's realities in this country. So it's really a mutual learning. Now, IFAD is growing as an institution in terms of how better engage with indigenous peoples, and indigenous peoples organizations are, let's say, also strengthen their institutional capacity, because when you have to report, and we know that, I mean, financial report is something like quite tough for an indigenous peoples organization, and IPAF is trying to be also a flexible instrument. So we don't think that are just indigenous people who are to adapt, no, and they have to adapt to our reporting. But we think that we have to find like a middle way, no, and see how we can sit together and find a way to play around it. And then what I can say is that we also have, of course, challenges. And one of these is that IPAF is he's having a lot of visibility, we know, because he's one of the very few established mechanisms for directly channel resources to indigenous peoples organizations. So we have there are a lot of expectations. So we used to launch call for proposal every 3 years. In the last one, we received 650 proposals, and we were able to fund only 53 projects, no? It's not just a matter of numbers, because as Brigitte was saying, now we are trying also to not only to provide resources for support projects, but also to allocate some funds for institutional strengthening of indigenous peoples organizations to make sure that more and more of them can directly submit their proposal and access to funds, not only to IPAF, but also to other funds. So as IFAD, even if we are trying to mobilize resources for the upcoming next EPAF cycle. At the same time, we are also advocating for direct resources to indigenous peoples' organization, also building up the experience that we had in working directly with them. Thank you.
Wonderful. Margarita, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, I'm delighted that, you know, some of those organizations that are getting money directly from you are now also being linked to the IFAD presence in the country. That's a win-win. And you know, I'm very, very keen to hear what Basiru Issa makes of this. Basiru works with the network of indigenous peoples and local communities for sustainable management of ecosystems in Central Africa. So you've heard 3 presentations there, Basiru, and in my mind, I was constantly thinking, so what is Basiru going to say about this? And in fact, even Brigitte herself did say, you would be not the sole arbiter of the success or failure of these projects, but a very important one. So please, tell us what you make of it. What has your experience been on the ground when accessing finance and official development assistance, and what is being done at the grassroots, at the local and regional level to improve the present situation? Over to you, Basiru.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you find yourself. It is a great honor for me to take part in this panel, which is very exciting. And also, as indigenous people, since we don't have that enough capacity to manage large funds, it means that I will not also have I will not also have the capacity to use only 5 minutes or 10 minutes. So you need to give me at least 20 minutes or 30 minutes so that I can manage.
It's been nice knowing you. No, Basiru, you'll get 5, maybe 6 minutes, because you know the father time waits for no man or woman. So Basiru, try and be lenient. Leave us wanting more. Go on.
Okay, no, it's just to play. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay. I had a presentation, but I think I will not do the presentation. I will talk from the heart and from the mind. And as you said, I am the Regional Secretary General for Indigenous Peoples Network called Revitalization, which works in the Congo Basin. It covers 8 countries, and it has 560 member organizations from the grassroots. Also, you know, actually, Revitalization is the co-chair of the Global Alliance for Territorial Communities. That is the global alliance which brings together 5 regional networks from Congo Basin, from Latin America, and also from Asia. So here I will be talking on behalf of indigenous peoples globally. So first of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to all the donors for all the efforts that they have been doing, you know, to support indigenous peoples. But looking at at what has been said, and I think I will just base from there and also just give 2 or 3 recommendations at the end. Indigenous people constitute 6% of the world population. Just imagine that one group represent 6%. It is at least huge. And today, when we are talking about funding, I saw the last report about 10%. Going directly to indigenous people's organizations. But just imagine that 90% is going to intermediaries. And I think about 30% is going to auditors. And at times, the questions that we ask ourselves, indigenous people, is, are these donors mobilizing resources for auditors, or they are mobilizing it for indigenous peoples? How can you pledge 1.7 billion and even 1.7 million cannot go to us, but they go to those who have to control whether we use the money or not? So the issue that indigenous people are posing here is the issue of confidence. It means that you don't have confidence on indigenous people's organizations. But I think today we agree with you that you have your procedures. But remember, we as indigenous people, we also think that if you have your procedures that cannot facilitate resources to us, it means that those procedures are exclusive. They're exclusive, and they are also discriminative. Because when you were developing, why can't you develop specific procedures for indigenous peoples that takes into account their traditional knowledge, their educational wise, and also their communities? It is not our fault, for example, that we live in a communities where we don't have a bank. It is not our fault that we live in a community that we don't have access to internet, that we cannot respond to your email. It is not our fault that we did not go to school, that we cannot write the reports that you want. It is not our fault that we are not speaking the English or French or German or Portuguese or Spanish that you speak. So it means that if you cannot develop policies, or you cannot develop procedures that can be adaptive to us, because what most donors are trying to do today is to assimilate us, that is to make us look like them, to make us speak their language, to make us do things the way they want to do. That is acculturation. Remember, for me as an indigenous person, I am an anthropologist. I did this PhD thesis on anthropology, which means that it's culture. So I did it on indigenous people. So I think all this needs to be taken into consideration when donors are mobilizing or trying to mobilize resources for indigenous peoples. So what we think is you cannot compare indigenous people organization or networks the same way you consider intermediaries, because what you do is you just transpose the procedures of, that is, you have standard procedures, no procedures for indigenous people because of their level, and no procedures for intermediaries. So I think all this need to be taken into consideration. And there is that issue of leaving no one behind, of which all of us are working today. How can you, that is, and there now when we talk about leaving no one behind, we talk about the issue of equity, because we think what most donors are doing, they are working on equality and not on equity. That is, they don't want to give this everybody the same possibility, but they have their standard way of doing. So I think there is notion of equity and equality when it comes to you. And today, indigenous people are trying now to see how they can respond to it. And also, when I was talking about discrimination, funds that are going to indigenous peoples are called small grants. Those who are going to others are called maybe big rounds, or I don't know what. So I think this concept, and I said the last week I'm talking about FPIC, and I don't think that is when you do the real FPIC, because today most donors are working with indigenous people's elites. For example, you are talking to me like Bashiru because I have that accessibility. But imagine that you are talking with my cousin, my friend, or my relative in the village who has never gone to school. So I think all this need to be taken into consideration. But how are indigenous people addressing this? Today, indigenous peoples are creating networks. IFAD, the colleague of IFAD, talk about having 3 indigenous people organizations that are recipients of funds that they redistribute. That is already a big step, and we encourage that, and we salute that. But I think you should go beyond that. For example, you might have a national organization because of their flexibility, because of their access to you and access to others. Yes, but today I think we should go beyond that. We should push for, that is, for regional organizations to have, for example, like regional networks. There are funding mechanisms that Brigitte mentioned. For example, today we have like a funding mechanism in Asia that is managed by Aman, the Nusantara Fund. Now in the Congo Basin, we have the Indigenous People Funding Mechanism led by Ripaliak that was launched in September. In Latin America, we also have one. So I think there is a need to continue this dialogue, and also be having proposals from indigenous peoples, also getting feedback from them, so that in the future we can have that, like we have the donor group, the pledge, the FCPL that we have. But I think we also have, for example, like the Global Alliance. We cannot pretend that we represent all indigenous people, but at least we represent the majority. So we can also have this so that we can continue making these proposals. Also, there is an issue of flexibility. I think funding that we should have flexibility, like I said, in terms of our procedures and all the likes. Also,
Issa, can I interrupt you for a second? Because you're going to have to land very shortly. And I just want to hear from you the answer to this question. You've heard Jenny and Brigitte talk about the pledge and then the new pledge, the potential new pledge. And you heard from Margarita talking about the Indigenous Peoples Assistance Facility. And I want to know whether you feel, from your position, those pledges and the changes that we hope will come as a result of that, and the new way that IPAF is working, is having any impact. Have you noticed any difference? Briefly,
Okay.
if you would.
Yeah, thank you. Those were my last 3 points on that. For the pledges, yes, there are impacts, though I think there were no maximum new funds, because I think the pledge went with the existing funds, so it was just to accommodate within the existing funds. And I think with the new pledge, indigenous people are trying to organize to make some proposals how the new pledge should take into account their preoccupations and their priorities. And on EPAF, I think there is a changes, because you see, for example, whatever the case, if they have sponsored at least 200 projects, whatever the case, they will create a change. I know, for example, like in East Africa, like even in Central Africa here, we know projects that are being funded by IPAF. We have our members who are beneficiaries of this project, that are these small grants that at least are creating impacts at the community level. So I will end here. If you have any question, I will be happy to answer this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Basiru. Thank you very much indeed. Excellent. Right. Okay. So I've got my two final panelists, and rather than giving presentations, they're going to essentially reflect on what's been said thus far by Jenny, by Brigitte, by Basiru, of course, and by Margarita, because we got a narrative there, and I know you were listening very, very hard. Ward Ansue here from FAO, and Christina Timponi Kambiaji from the International Land Coalition. What do you make of it, and how does it play into what you think is changing or still needs to change in this area? I'm going to go to you first of all, Christina.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you so much for inviting us to be here. My name is Christina. For those who doesn't know, we are the International Land Coalition. We are proudly hosted by IFAD, and we are a coalition that has among its membership more than 300 organizations, many of them representing indigenous peoples, local communities, and also pastoralists. We are witness of the work that IFAD does with the IPAF and the respectful relationship that you have with the indigenous organizations, not only with them, but also with the small farmers, right? And I think this is an example that should be reflected in many other ways of working with indigenous peoples and communities. But first of all, I would like to thank Birgit for your recommendations. We agree completely, 100% with all of them. In the perspective of a coalition, we also don't speak on behalf of our members. So I'm glad Basiru was here speaking for indigenous peoples and for himself. But in our perspective, a pledge like the one that is being discussed here, we were also very happy, Jenny, when this was announced in the COP a few years ago. As working with land tenure rights, we are very happy to see donors looking attention to land tenure rights in a different way. But we will have to say that one of the things that we would like to see different for this time is that we can expand the attention not only to tropical forests, but also other ecosystems, like Brigitte presented in her recommendation. We have many members that work in the rangelands areas that represent pastoralists that also play a huge role on biodiversity conservation, but also in the carbon stocking. No, and I think also we should not look at them only as groups that play a role that are useful for us, but also right holders. As I saw you on your presentation, I'm very happy to see that the attention is very much now for rights and not only for indigenous peoples playing the role of guardians of forest, which they do, but we shouldn't be worried in protecting their lands only because of that, right? Because they deserve to have their lands and territories protected. And when it comes to the operational side of a pledge like this, I agree that indigenous peoples, they claim to receive direct funding, and this is very much aligned with what we believe. ILC strategy now has one of these main components, a power shift, so shifting power back to the communities. And of course, this means that all the stakeholders, I don't like very much this word, but I know this is the word that everybody understands. All the stakeholders need somehow to adapt and change a little bit mentalities, right? We are used to see very much sometimes an approach that is patronizing in relation to communities and not indigenous peoples and pastoralists, all the communities that comes from the land and live from the land. We think that those organizations, they deserve to have the ownership, you know, of what the priorities are, and to decide how these funds should be used, and this takes time. And I think the donors' mentality needs to adapt also to this reality, because indigenous peoples, they need to consult their peers, no, to take decisions. And when we rush processes, the risk of not working is very big. So we all need to understand that to change mentalities, it means all the levels, no, donors, intermediaries like us, like other organizations. ILC is a coalition. We are member-led, so we don't see ourselves as NGOs. We play a role of facilitating things among our members, and these sometimes includes also playing a role of intermediary between a funder and a member of ILC. But we think that all these scenario needs to change in the sense that we need to work to give conditions for those organizations to be able to receive funds without changing so much the way they work and so much what they exist for, because we don't expect that the indigenous peoples will be sitting in the office, writing reports in the way that many of us do. So maybe simplifying the way and the criteria and the expectations on paperwork, it can be something good. I heard once one of our members saying, it would be very nice if we could propose, answer a proposal like doing videos, showing our community, showing what we do in the ground, things like that, that I think it can sound strange in a first moment, but it can be also innovative in this whole scenario. Thank you. I don't know if I have more time.
No, you don't, Christina, you don't, sorry. We're running over time even now, but thank you very much. Because one or two of our presentations at the beginning were a little bit long, but we were setting the scene, and so I allowed it to breathe. But that means now that Ward, you have the difficult task of answering that key question. How much of a difference is this making, these pledges, these shifts, welcome though they are? I got the impression earlier from Basiru that actually a lot of indigenous peoples are still unhappy and impatient for real change to be really recognized, and not to have so much filtered through intermediaries or accountants or advisors or etc. So how do you see things? How much of a difference is it making? And if not, how do we accelerate it?
Thanks. Thanks, Henry. Yeah, you're right. What Basiru said was not all positive, of course. But he also said he saw changes. He was grateful for the new support coming in, etc. Let's keep in mind that we're talking here in a three-year lifespan. The pledge was in 2021. These discussions on reaching the people, leaving no one behind in the framework of finance are relatively new. And what we see, and I think what Jenny just presented, the 10%, is indeed a good increase and a bit of a surprise, because we were still stuck on the 2%. So it's a very positive trend we see here. So I hope that this will speed up from now, that we started understanding the bits and bolts of doing, and hopefully has more impact in the future. How to accelerate, how to do it, etc. I think we start understanding, but there's one thing that comes out of this session that maybe I hear a bit more than yesterday and this morning, and which might be important to emphasize, and that's the devolution. Yesterday we spoke a lot about more finance, the need for innovative finance, the need of better quality of finance, etc. What I heard here is, how do we do that? How do we bring that a step back forward? And that's where I think the devolution comes in. And I'd like to cite here what comes out of the Good Climate Finance Guide. Principle number 1 is the need for devolving decision-making to the lowest appropriate levels, giving local institutions and communities more direct access to finance and power to decide how to define, how to prioritize, how to design, and how to implement actions, monitor them, monitor their progress, and evaluate their success. And I think that's what we've heard here through the pledge, but certainly through what Brigitte and IFAD has been presenting, and Basiru alluded it several times, is how do we bring all these decision-making processes, all these funding mechanisms closer to the ground where the money is needed and where the impact is needed. And I think out of this discussion, I heard three building blocks or 3 principles. And the first one is getting these building blocks right. And we heard about land rights. Jenny said it, we need to engage in constructive land reform. They need to have their rights right. First of all, to be able to use the money afterwards, to invest sustainably, but also to be recognized. And that's what we heard as well, to be recognized often for these territorial population groups and indigenous peoples and local communities. It's through their land rights. It's also about capacity building and creating the capacity from a human perspective, but also from an institutional perspective, we've heard as well. Secondly, is about new partnerships. And we've heard devolving means cutting some intermediaries or cutting the intermediaries, but you also heard that we cannot cut all these intermediaries. There's some intermediaries that have to be there, probably at a more local level, and certainly under different configuration. And I think Brigitte mentioned it very well, and you mentioned it as well, with direct involvement of indigenous peoples within these new financial institutions at a lower level. So redefining how they are structured, redefining how they work. And then thirdly, lastly, is flexibility. Basiru mentioned it several times: flexibility, adaptability, and inclusiveness of the funding themselves, but certainly of the funding processes and institutions. And I'll stop it here.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Well landed and nice, lean and on budget. Thank you very much indeed. Sadly, no time for questions because people do need their little coffee in the bathroom break, and then to resume here in just over 10 minutes at 11:40 for the synthesis panel and closing. So let me thank the panelists award. Thank you very much indeed, Brigitte. Thank you very much, Margarita, Basiru, and Christina. Thank you very much indeed for this. And I'm really hoping that this progress that we've heard of, you know, the issues that Basiru and others mentioned notwithstanding, will be accelerated, you know, and the kinds of things that we raise here and the kind of issues that we're concerned about will actually make real world impacts on the ground. As we said, the same thing yesterday with the agripreneurs, you know, because some of it is not reaching them and they're having to go for personal loans or depend on competitions, you know, to win like a Dragon's Den in order to get their funding. Well, we are trying to make sure that it's equitable, that there is equity, and that people are, their lives are touched. Because these are people who want to work with the land, with the forests, with the flora and the fauna. A lot of us don't want to do it, but they want to do it. And it's their birthright if they're from those places. So please. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for Brigitte and also to Jenny and to Basiru. Thank you very much indeed. We'll see you again. Thank you. You're not still in the
I'm good, don't worry. Don't worry.
I think you're still in the infectious state.
Oh.
Yeah, thank you. Picture, please. I'll be right. Come closer, please. Come closer. Closer. Yeah. You want to sit here? Yeah. Okay.
Down. Go down.
Yeah. Thank you. Cheers. Thank you. Good to see you. Thank you very much. Good to see you again. Thank you very much. That's great stuff. I'm pleased to see that it's working. You know, you've got some good examples. Just recently law and that to be the default as opposed to an outlier. Yeah. So at the moment, I think it's still an outlier.
Yes.
Isn't it? Which is great, but we don't want to be special. We want to be normal.
Thank you.
was already tight like this. Do that. Well, let me have a little bit. I don't know.
Also just use one of the normal chairs for Henry and put it on one side or in the middle, and he can.
Yeah.
Do you think that's fine going to allow it to take that here? That's one. It just needs to. Yeah, no?
Not bad enough.
Yeah.
Just not.
There's lots of glasses, water.
I don't know.
Good, no?
No one used.
Yeah, no, I changed it.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. Word was hacking, so.
Not bad. Yeah.
Wherever you prefer up there.
Pre-seating, I believe.
Pre-seating.
Yeah.
Here I am.
Thank you very much, everybody. So this is the final push, as it were. This has been a marathon, not a sprint, but we're getting to the home straight. Okay, the home straight before we kick for the tape, as it were. And we want to use a lot of the thinking from the last day and a half to come to some conclusions vis-a-vis where this financial AGA really has taken us, and what the future direction of the GDPRD could and should be. And one or two overarching questions before I introduce the panelists. That term catalytic, based on the conversations we've had in the last day or two, what does it really mean in practice? You know, how is it going to influence the thinking and the decisions of the donors, where they channel their resources in the ODA? What's the balance between donors being more catalytic and simply needing to invest a lot more? Because we know more money is needed. Well, how do you make it work harder, go further? We talked about the historically high levels of ODA yesterday, but increasing fragmentation, the challenges in achieving the SDGs, especially number 2, and widening financing and development gaps, key. And we talked a lot about blended and innovative finance mechanisms. The first time I heard about blended finance was when the then Foreign Minister of Norway, Børge Brende, talked about blended finance at the Financing for Development event in Addis Ababa. And also, I remember at Addis Ababa and in New York at the UN General, and we go, blended finance, whoa, 9 years on. Do we understand it yet? That's it, reforming the aid architecture. And Bruce will bristle at this, the post-ODA. He said, don't use that term, post-ODA, the post-ODA future. That was what he was saying yesterday. He said, because we're going to will this, we're going to almost wish it into reality. So there we go. Reducing fragmentation. So there's a whole number of things we want to try and synthesize in this session. And let me introduce our panelists. And those of you watching online, you are free to send in a question or a thought, and we'll try and get to it before the end of this session. We've got Jim Woodhill on my immediate left, Senior Advisor at the Global Donor Platform for Rural Development. We have Karen Smaller, who, is that you, Karen? Smile if it's you. She is the co-founder and Executive Director at the Shamba Center for Food and Climate, the co-founder of HESAT 2030. Weren't you here in person last year? I think you were you not? Yes, you were. I do remember you. Yes, that's right. Then we have Tim Diphorn. Tim was part of our breakout session yesterday. The Europe Director of Business Development, One Acre Fund. Good to see you, Tim. We have Natalia Toschi. Yes? Yes! Aha! Thanks to my briefing for Maurizio, I did not fail. And Natalia is Head of Funding, Treasury Division of IFAD, and Chief Investment Officer at AgDefco. So thank you very much, Natalia. And we also have Agnes Johan, Head of Blended Finance at Rabo Partnerships, who led one of our sessions yesterday. And last but by no means least, and she's in the middle, deliberately, Janice Achieng, the owner of the Agnesa Bakery, country representative of the YPAD in Kenya. And in fact, I'm going to just, I'm actually going to start off with Janice, actually, because I wasn't going to, but Jim said earlier, why don't you? And I said, no. I shrugged off Jim's suggestion. But now I'm coming round to it. There is wisdom in his suggestion. Because, as I've said a couple of times, what you and others, Monique and others, Prosper, are going through is critical, and you have to be successful, and many more young people like you have to be successful. I just want to hear, first of all, from you, whether you feel this is helping you and is helping other young people in your situation who are agripreneurs, who don't get to come to Rome to be here at events like this, but who hope that you are going to speak for them and that you're going to be successful and they're going to be successful. What do you feel of what you've heard?
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
It's a bit personal. Well, I really feel great in the sense that most often we have had experience sharing on successes. And my story, I believe, resonates very well with very many young entrepreneurs out there. And I believe that them hearing me on this platform and unpacking the challenges that I have gone through will give them hope that they can also have that opportunity to also share and look forward to what can come out of this, because we're also hopeful that together with our experiences, we are looking at how it is going to shape the outcome of this assembly. How will it be integrated at the end of it all? Yeah.
And do you feel from the last day and a half that you have a positive message to take back to Kenya with you? Because some of your colleagues, your friends in the area, fellow agripreneurs will say to you, what happened? How are things going to change? Can I get support? How will you respond? I'm concerned now. How are you going to answer? Go on.
Yeah, there's hope. And what really excited me that I will carry home is that tracking the financial flows in the food systems. And I also look forward to tracking of the impact of financing in our food systems. So when I go back home, I have the confidence in sharing with my network, with my community, on how concerned donors are about their well-being, on how concerned donors are about their enterprises, and what feedback they have and how it can change how they do financing. So I'm very hopeful, and I look forward to also bringing back feedback from my network.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for that, Janice. We'll come back to you a little bit later, but for now, I want to segue to go to Tim Diphorn, who is on my far left, the Europe Director of Business Development at the One Acre Fund, because interestingly, one of your colleagues, One Acre colleagues in Rwanda, had been working with a young agripreneur also in Rwanda called Prosper, who was doing, was it avocado oil? I think it was. I'm just wondering how you would respond to Janice, and also talk a little bit more about what One Acre does, the work you do with smallholder farmers across several countries in Africa, and the partnerships perhaps that you're establishing, please.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone, for having the chance to be here and explain a bit more about what One Acre Fund does. I hear your story, Janice. I think that for One Acre Fund, we try to put farmers first in everything we do. Though you're not a farmer, but we see kind of similar issues that smallholder farmers face in the countries where we operate. So just a little bit about One Acre Fund. We're a nonprofit social enterprise operating in 9 countries in Eastern Africa and Nigeria. We started out with 40 farmers in Western Kenya in 2006, and we have scaled now to reaching over 5 million smallholder families. Our mission is to improve food security and bolster climate resilience, especially the latter one. Climate resilience is becoming ever more important in the times that we face right now. I think the reason why we have been able to scale is that we put farmers first, as I said. We have a holistic package of services we offer, where we offer farmers inputs on credit. We have a last mile delivery infrastructure. We offer them training and market facilitation. It's this combined bundle that we employ and that we hope to help farmers become more prosperous. They repay us, and that's part of our business model. So within our program itself, we have a blended finance model. I think as we continue to scale, one of the ingredients that has been very important is being locally based. So We work with field officers that we recruit in the communities that we operate in, and we have over 5,000 of these field officers running around in rural villages in Africa. They're often farmers themselves. They know the context, they know the issues, they speak the language. And that's very important if you want to train smaller farmers in a language that is more accessible and that they can relate to, and make trainings simple and practical. At the same time, we also have embedded our operations in these areas. So we have our headquarters located in rural settings. In fact, 95% of our staff are based in rural settings. So as an organization, we see blended finance as a way of kind of operating. As a social enterprise, we have 3 ways that we operate. We have farmer revenues. So these farmers repay us. That covers 3/4 of our operating model. The power of this is that farmers are clients. So they actually have a very strong power in commanding kind of the delivery of the services. If they don't like the services we offer, we will know that because they will not work with us. Yeah. So it's a very instant kind of feedback we get and allows us to keep improving. It also gives them ownership and commandment to kind of decide for themselves what they would like to do. That model is basically 3/4 financed by farmers, hence the 1 Acre Fund. However, we still need grant funding. So we also have grant funding from donors like the Dutch government, but also philanthropic organizations that support us. And then third, we also attract debt, concessional debt, because we have a cash flow crunch, because we need to order inputs in bulk. At the moment when farmers want to plant, it means we have a cash flow kind of crunch that we need to resolve. So we work with finance institutions like DFC, Proparco, but also impact investors attracting concessional debt. So our model is a blended finance model, you could say. And I think looking at the future of ODA, that could be a way kind of moving forward to try to blend all these instruments together and looking at creating more impact.
You paused, which gives me a chance to
Yes.
intervene, which is good, because before you go down another avenue, which is good because you've mentioned blended and blending a couple of times, and one of the key speakers on blending and blended finance is sitting to my second left. Agnes is thinking, he's coming to me. Agnes Johan is head of blended finance at the Rabo Partnerships. And you heard me, I deliberately talked about the first time I heard that term in 2015 at the Financing for Development version 1 in Addis Ababa. And I'm just wondering where we are, how mature the blended or the blending models are, and are they operating at the scale that we would desire at this point? And if not, what is going to get us to where we think blending should be able to take us?
Thanks.
You're looking at me with concern.
No, there's no concern. That's fine. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm heading blended finance, so I do have a view on how to apply public and private capital together. I think there are islands of excellence, but not a sea of improvement. So I think there's room for improvements, and also especially on how you scale up all these blended vehicles. And yesterday we had quite some conversations. So do we need to be more innovative? I think we can conclude that a lot of the instruments and tools are already out there. It's much more about how do we apply them creatively and quickly. And I think I haven't been to many of these more donor focused events. So I wanted to share just a few observations from a private sector player, as I think I can qualify myself. So yesterday we talked about mobilizing private capital, right? So it's a language thing, it's an understanding thing, but it's also time. I think private sector is much more action oriented. So if you start to involve them, or they reach out to you, then it just goes, I think, at a different pace. And it doesn't mean that we all need to change, but it's just good to realize. It's the same for us to realize how government budgets are part of an annual budget process, and it's just different. So when you start working on mobilizing capital, it's just good to understand the starting point of each and every partner. I think the other thing for the private sector to step into this room is really, what is the business case? Impact, yes, it's important, but in the end, there needs to be some kind of return somewhere made. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because it also drives efficiency, but it's just good to realize because sometimes donor conversations and the word profit don't really go into one room very well, right? But I think if we are all seeing that the funding gap is huge, there's multiple definitions for that. I think all are fair, but the same conclusion is that it's huge. I think it's good to realize that it should go hand in hand because the only way you can really mobilize private capital is to embed that thinking. And the other observation is, and that's why I'm really grateful that you're here in the room, is that if we as a bank approach a growing portfolio, as I say, so we think who's the client? And I think for the donor community, it's the same, right? Who's your client? Who's the ultimate beneficiary? It's people like you. It's countries, it's governments that receive the funding. And then for us, it starts with, okay, so what is the problem? What am I trying to solve for you? And what can we actually offer then as a bank? Do we have any financial solution for your question? But then on top of that, we do bring our own agenda as well, which I think for donors is super important. But it comes as a third question. It doesn't come first. I don't go to a commodity trader and say, look, you're in the cocoa sector. I think your child labor is an issue. I think you're in the cocoa sector. You're part of the problem. You're also part of the solution. What do you need? How can we tackle that problem together? But it's a different approach. And I really liked the professor in the starting moment that said, let's reimagine. And I would really like, maybe if we all can reimagine a little bit and think, who's the client or who's the beneficiary? Who are we doing it for? It's for you. Yeah, so that was my thought on this.
Thank you very much.
Henry, can I just add something on the blended finance?
Absolutely, Karen. I was about to go to you, but yes, please get involved. Yes.
Because I think this is so critical, given that we have 1 Acre here, we have the SME, we have Rabo. Because the reality is, whilst we're all promoting blended finance, and whilst Shamba is a huge advocate of it, the current scale of it is negligible. I just want to show you one image from the latest Convergence report, which tracks blended finance. So this is showing you the overall blended finance market. You know, it's not showing you the agriculture portion, it's overall. Last year, there was $14 billion put into blended finance and 99 transactions. It's pittance. We're talking about needing trillions of dollars of investment to solve these big problems that we've been speaking about for the last 2 days. And the current blended finance market, or the last year's blended finance market, was 14 billion. So I think the point I want to make here is just to echo what everybody's saying. If we do want to reach this, what we call the missing middle, right? These millions of SMEs who are the sort of engine for getting this transformation that we want in the food system, we really have to massively invest in these innovative ideas we've heard about for the last 2 days, we've been reading about. Most of the donors in the room are experimenting, but the scale is so tiny that we're not even scratching the surface.
Karen, can I ask you why you think we're not even scratching the surface for all the warm words, the positivity, and the business case that people say is being made? Why? What's holding us back?
So I think the reality is the risks of investing in both this missing middle group and in these low-income countries are too high to get that additional finance. And I think we have to be honest that that risk factor is the most prohibitive factor. A lot of the initiatives we've heard about for the last few days are trying to mitigate that risk, are trying to use grant money to cover the risk. But the reality is it's too risky for the commercial sector. And Rabo's a bit of a misnomer in the sector because they do go to risky places, unlike a lot of the other banks. But it is too risky. And so...
And Karen, let me pause a second. Is it a reality? Because I've been speaking to a number of colleagues here who are talking about 98% repayment rate, very, very small failure rate, dealing with the missing middle, dealing with people in rural areas, dealing with people who the regular commercial sector wouldn't touch. They say, these guys, they understand the transaction, it's a deal, it's a business, and they're repaying at 98%. That's one particular case. I think I was talking to somebody who was working in Kenya. Is it perception, or I suppose perception is reality, isn't it?
I mean, I think I'd let One Acre and Rabo respond more to that, since they're lending to these farmers or these SMEs. I think that's a pretty rosy picture, 98% return, especially when we're talking about farmers or SMEs in the processing, packaging, distribution sector.
Okay, I'm going to have a quick response from Tim. What's the return
Yeah,
rate?
in our experience, for the microloans that we offer, which are between $50 to $150 for really the smallholder farmers, we see around 96% repayment rate year on out. In countries like Burundi, it's even 100%, if you can imagine.
Wow.
The poorest, one of the poorest countries in the world. So I think that's not really the issue. It's just that having it being accessible and affordable, that's the challenge. And banks are requiring too much collateral, other information that these farmers cannot provide. So I think that's the issue. It's actually just making it accessible and affordable.
All right, thank you. I'm going to bring in Jim Woodhill, because as well as being a senior advisor to the Global Donor Platform for Rural Development, he's also the lead of the Foresight for Food initiative. And I presume what you do there is you talk to governments, to organizations, multilaterals, businesses, and tell them what the future of food looks like. I was wondering how aligned the future of food that you sketch, the vision you give to them, is with what they bring back to you and with this agenda.
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the reflections for me out of the last couple of days is basically we need to shift the narrative and advocate a lot more for the benefits from investing in food systems.
Mm-hmm.
So, whether you're talking to treasuries at a national government, whether we're talking to donor governments, that actually making an investment in food systems is going to save us from a lot of grief in the long run and a lot of bigger costs. So I think partly we need to shift the narrative from, we've got a huge financing gap, we've got all these problems, to look at all the opportunities and potentials. Now, that doesn't negate the fact that I think we are going to have to dramatically ramp up the public investment in this. And I think we have to be careful about being naive that somehow the private sector is going to come in and pour in a whole lot of money into stuff that has a huge, basically public good cost and benefit. Now, I think where we're still at is really asking the big question, how much more public sector funding do we need to get private sector to ramp up to a scale that really has a big difference? And I think that would be a really interesting sort of question to ask. And I think Karen was mentioning risk. So I think one of the issues also is not only the risk, but the transaction costs of, as Tim was talking about, of having a whole staff of people working with small and medium scale enterprises to actually get that finance and those financial services out. Mm-hmm. So, it's that cost of delivery as well as the risk factor that comes into being a barrier for the private sector. And maybe just one other reflection for a moment on the positive side. I mean, I've done a lot of work with young entrepreneurs in Africa over the last couple of years. And I guess it's super, super inspiring to see and hear how many other young African entrepreneurs are really trying to engage in this whole idea of social entrepreneurship. Yeah. So I think that also, I mean, it's very easy to get a bit negative about all of this, but when you look at the amount of energy and enthusiasm and passion for doing something different, that's really there. And so sometimes I wonder whether we actually need to get those positive stories up and actually show the rest of the world what some great young people are actually doing, and that by investing in them, that really can be the future.
Tell us, it's still a supplementary. I mean, given what you've said and the positive report you've just given, I mean, how can some of the development actors, both in this room and outside, prepare for new approaches to ODA and aid to food? Because I mean, I like the fact we had a conversation yesterday, you and I, about the work you're doing with Foresight for Food, talking to a whole range of actors in Southeast Asia, for example, and trying to explain to people there and in other places what the future of food looks like.
Well, I mean, for donors, I think two basic things. I think responding to Karen's comment, I think donors do need to up the amount of money they're putting into various blended finance mechanisms to drive more finance. So, we've had in previous global donor meetings the whole discussion about how much money is going into fairly fragmented projects. So I don't think tackling that issue is one that donors probably could do relatively easily. I think the other one is investing in process. So we've talked that you have to get the whole ecosystem working well. Tim's mentioned about how you need to bring people together. So sometimes I think there's a bit of a tendency from donors to want to focus on very concrete outputs and impacts without realizing to get those impacts and outcomes, you actually have to have a good process behind that. And so you need people with the right capabilities, the right skills, the understanding of both the agriculture sector and the finance sector. And so investing in those processes, dialogues, that whole brokering function, I think is really, really, really critical.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I'm going to bring in our final speaker at this point, Natalia Toski. And Natalia is laughing because I pronounce her name correctly. Yes. No, it's just because of a little discussion we had earlier. And Natalia is head of funding at the Treasury Division of IFAD. Treasury Division, I said that again. Okay, it means, yes. Okay, so can you explain? You probably haven't heard much. Well, you were not here yesterday.
No, I wasn't.
But I mean, we heard, was it Joe Puri who was here?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. She gave a very energetic speech about the way in which IFAD is adapting to the new realities. So can you explain from the Treasury Division how IFAD has expanded its funding sources over the past decade to overcome the shortages we've been talking about in official development assistance, and also the pros and cons of this evolution?
Thank you very much. And thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. And actually, I will answer your question, but everything I heard in the last 20 minutes triggered a lot of thoughts, which anyhow, so to answer your question, so you may know that IFAD has been, we've been around for quite some time. IFAD was founded in 1977. And officially, originally, it's always been funded through paid-in capital from donors, right? And then for the reasons that I think you've discussed and we've discussed and we keep discussing, which is ODA is not enough, and ODA to agriculture, I think it's around 5% of total ODA. We started thinking, okay, how can we deliver more? Where can we find additional money, right? And that was a long journey. I've been here for quite some time, but it started 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, we actually started to borrow money. And I want to link it to everything that I heard about the concept of blending, because you know that IFAD's clients actually stretch from low-income countries to lower-income countries and upper-middle-income countries, right? So we have a balance sheet. I don't want to bore you with technicalities, but the clients basically have access to different types of money, from grants, the ones that are, for example, in debt distress, according to the IMF, to concessional loans, to blend loans, what we call blend loans, and to closer to market loans. And that's actually an advantage for IFAD because we can use different type of money in to satisfy the needs of different types of money out, right? And that's already in and on itself, at a high level, the concept of blending. So this allowed us basically to blend or actually to add to the funds that our donor gives us through replenishment, borrowed money. So we started borrowing from big development banks like KfW, Agence Française de Développement. We got a loan from the European Investment Bank. So all of this started 10 years ago. Slowly but surely then, and this also links to the Addis Ababa Action Plan, we heard that we really needed to leverage the private sector more. And this is when we started the process of getting 2 credit ratings. So in 2020, we got 2 credit ratings from S&P, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. And this basically at AA+, which is only 1 notch below the highest possible credit rating, which is AAA.
Wow.
And I can also tell you why we didn't get a AAA. Anyhow. And so then after we got this in place, we started the big next step together, supported with the board, and a lot of discussions took place there. And we started issuing bonds on financial markets. And that was basically what we started doing in 2022. So we issue sustainable bonds. Now,
let me just say a word why, sustainable bonds. Again, because everything that we do with our projects is financing the SDGs and sustainable projects, projects that basically merge together an aspect of green finance and social finance. So if you look at what, types of projects IFAD finances, they have elements of green finance and elements of social when we look at all the things that we do when it comes to people-centric approaches, training and everything. So our bonds are really purely the merge of these two, and this is why we call them sustainable bonds. And so when
can I ask you, sorry, what kind of appetite did you get and what kind of response? Because I'm really interested.
Yeah. So I should add, to answer this question precisely, I should add that so far IFAD is only allowed to issue private placements. So we don't do big public benchmarks. And as you will know from Rabobank as well, this kind of also limits, the universe of investors. But there is a huge still universe of investors that invest in private placements, especially when it comes to pension funds and insurance companies, because these are the typical, what we call impact investors, that would basically buy a bond not only for the financial returns, and for sure the financial returns need to be there. So we have to agree on the interest rate that we pay, but also they have very outspoken interest in supporting SDGs and institutions like IFAD that make a real difference and a real impact. So again, to answer your question, the beginning was a bit rough because the moment we were ready to issue, the war started in Ukraine. That was like that moment. And so everyone on financial markets really wanted very liquid securities, whereas our bonds are not liquid. They are typically buy and hold. So we had like the first couple of months, I lost sleep. I was like, oh my God, now everything is ready. But then actually when we started, then it became easier and easier. So far we've issued 8 bonds for a total of 644 million. And every year, I have to say, it becomes easier because the name is out there, the mission is really compelling and important. And the more you do that, and the more, we have investor interest, and it became easier and easier. So this was, as I always say, a big step for IFAD. We are not the first ones to issue bonds. By all means, it's not an innovation as such in absolute terms, but it was a big, big step for IFAD. And if you allow me, can I just say a couple of other things?
Briefly.
Very briefly. Yeah. No, because you talked very much about fragmentation and about devolution. So basically how the money then reaches, how can we make sure that the money goes where it's supposed to go?
Yes.
And so what comes together with these bonds is the obligation and the duty to report to investors exactly where the money goes, right? So we are actually, tomorrow we're launching our second impact report, which actually really shows through our reporting system, through the projects that are financed, how many people we're supposed to reach, what exactly we're supposed to do with that money. And this I think is key for accountability when it comes to these chunks of money that you could say, okay, where do they end up? What do we do with this? I didn't answer the part about risks and opportunities because I don't have time, but if you want, I can.
I'll come back to you. I just want to bring in Karen for a second because okay, you're saying there's something that has to be said now, something so pertinent. No pressure. No. The reason is because I was watching Karen and she hasn't spoken for a bit, and obviously you're virtual. We wanted to bring you back into the room because I remember at last year's AGA, both the platform, the Chamber Centre, released a joint inquiry, and this was about increasing the impact of donor and public funds on food systems, and through innovative financing. And not everybody will remember what that inquiry delivered, what it said. Can you just remind us briefly what the conclusion was, or the conclusion, and how much change you've seen in the past year?
Yep, thanks. And I might also use it as a chance to respond to some of those comments. But we basically did an inquiry looking at the blended finance market and how we can better reduce those risks and leverage more of the private sector finance through catalytic public finance. I mean, one of our key messages was that if donors and development finance institutions are willing to take more risk with their money, that we have the potential to leverage $4 of private finance for every $1 of public money. That was the key message. And so I want to come back to this risk issue because I think it's important. And I think one of the challenges we have with the way the DFIs are currently run, the development finance institutions, is that they do not take the risky positions that are needed to move us from billions of dollars to trillions of dollars, which is what we need to finance this investment gap. And I think the example is it Anna, that Anna just raised about IFAD finally getting a AA credit rating, is the problem we're seeing with a lot of the multilateral development banks. Their credit rating is so precious and they're so scared to lose that AA credit rating that they tend to go for the less risky investments. And what that does is it crowds out the private sector that we're trying to attract. And that was one of the things that came out of our inquiry. A lot of the private investors that we spoke to said the development banks are crowding us out. So I think going forward, and this was one of our key recommendations, and on this panel talking about where the GDPRD should go, I think the donor community needs to help these DFIs because they are the owners in the end of these banks to be able to take more risk. Now, I recognize that the credit rating is important to be able to go on capital markets and issue bonds or, mobilize more private capital. But we've got to find a way to both protect their balance sheets and that nice credit rating they have, while at the same time getting them to take more risk and filling in that void. And in that sense, I would say, Jim, I think we have to move past the positive narrative stories to getting our development institutions, and I'm talking globally, the finance ones and the donors, to take the risks we need to cover that risk that's preventing others from going in to help us move from the billions to the trillions.
Okay. Thank you, Karen. I'm just got to go to Agnes, Head of Blended Finance at Rabo Partnerships. How would you respond to Karen's clarion call for all kinds of entities to take more risks to get us from the billions to the trillions? Without it, we're not going to get there, she says.
No, totally agree. I totally agree. I mean, Karen, we can be super critical on the DFIs and whether they are pushing out the commercial sector. That's not necessary. I think we all have a role to play in this whole ecosystem. But I think it was striking that the IFC lady yesterday mentioned that she was very proud of financing a Ukraine grain exporter, but so are we again, right? So yeah, I mean, yes, it is very important, and yes, we all have a role. But I think the DFIs can be maybe a little bit more creative, and I don't know if FMO is still in the room because I saw them, but they've set up, and I think IFC has done the same. They need to also manage their balance sheet, right? They're also a bank. So if they are issuing bonds, they also need to be mindful of their own rating. But the both institutes have been very creative by packaging loans on their own balance sheet, and then they put it in a special purpose vehicle. I'm getting very technical here now, people, but it's blended finance. And in that vehicle, they put the first loss tranche with their own capital, but it allowed then for the average rating of that securitized portfolio, as we call it, to be AAA rated, and that allowed the big insurance companies to participate. So both of them has done that. What the result of that very technical thing on the back end side of their balance sheet is that they're releasing part of the balance sheet, right? It opens up room for them to then move again into new deals, new markets, and pushing the boundaries. But it's hard, right? Everybody has a role to play. I think let's focus here on the food and agri sector. And I think there we will see that you need to find a solution to go down to these smaller ticket sizes. So your observation, Tim, is very, very, very well. It's the cost of getting the money there, right? We need to be smarter with that. So from our side at Partnerships, we're trying to digitalize these value chain. We're trying to use that digital data and transaction flows that are out there for alternative credit scoring because there's no collateral. But also the fact that African banking is really leapfrogging towards the mobile banking, right? You don't need to have offices everywhere. And there's a lot of people who have mobile phones. So that makes the financial inclusion a totally different conversation. Risks, definitely still there. But then also be smart with your risk. Young entrepreneurs looking for finance, very, very hard. But are more is setting up more impact funds like 1 Acre, which does a great job. Don't get me wrong. But yesterday's session with the young agripreneurs, it showed me that it's sheer luck. If you're in the country which has a program that supports young entrepreneurs and you get investment, great, really well done. But if you're not, or if you're in Kenya and you haven't been able to tap into these programs, I mean, it seems to be so much more luck. So what is a more structural solution for that? And I think we need to be a little bit more maybe thinking about that.
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. And let me go to Janice, because, of course, you and Maureen and Prosper were in that session. When you hear people talking about risk, in the end, if you get down to the real grassroots level, it means too risky to invest in what you're trying to do, what you and thousands, if not millions of people up and down, not just Africa, but elsewhere around the world are trying to do. But yet we constantly at events like this talk about connecting and innovating and de-risking and reaching out to and working with you. So how can it be made easier to connect you with the finances you need? Because clearly you're passionate, you're a teacher, you could continue to work as a teacher, but you're also trying to be an entrepreneur and to have an impact socially and sustainably. What is needed? I mean, are you hearing of any innovations in Kenya that are trying to help young people to be entrepreneurs, particularly in agriculture? Do you hear of any of these innovations at all?
Yes, in Kenya, there are some innovative finance mechanisms.
Yeah.
There are those that are granted by the government. We have the Youth Enterprise Development Fund. We have the Uwezo Fund, Hustler Fund, quite a number of them. And there's also the Enable Youth Program.
Yeah.
That's supported by Agricultural Finance Corporation, that's for government. But this is really not inclusive, especially the Enabled Youth Program, that it targets graduates out of school, and they're taken through incubation for a period of time. Then now they can get loans, startups. They repay at 0%. And after that, for scaling up, they would pay at 5%. But see, this is not really inclusive, because if you're looking at young people in the rural setup, most of them have not gone to the universities. And those who have gone to the universities, they don't want to come back home. Yeah. So, they are so much disintegrated. I mean, one government with all these very many funds, and we are looking at a devolved system as well. So we really need, for me to also get through, we need to have a harmonized system.
Yeah.
So that we have more youths benefiting. You'd find in my community, 1 or 2 are benefiting from all these funds, but quite a number they don't have a way out, like myself. They really don't have a way out. Yeah. So we also have those that are supported by private sectors. Like I mentioned yesterday, Safaricom's DG Farm.
Yeah.
It's an online platform that onboards, it's the same model as 1 Acre Fund. They have input suppliers, so many, it's multi-sectoral. And then we also have those that are supported by banks like Equity. And other than that, the development partners, like right now, there's a program called NAV CDP supported by World Bank. But even that has its own fair of challenge, because then there are particular value chains that are looked at. In my case, if you ask me, I am into pumpkin. But in my community, the NAV CDP program is working on 3 value chains: poultry, dairy, and tomatoes. And all these people are also expected to group themselves and form cooperatives. And lately we've got a notice from the county government ward level department that the program cannot kick off yet because we don't have enough groups. Yeah. So other areas, well, it is continuing after getting into groups, forming a cooperative, and then having a circle. Then the money will be channeled through the circle and you build your shares. It will take a while. Yeah. So.
Wow. I'm just wondering, Tim, I mean, your response to what Janice has said, and how do you, in what you do at 1 Acre, try to make sure that there are not lots of young people who have potential, who have ideas, but for some reason your programs are just not touching them?
Well, I think that was a really good overview, Janice. There's a lot out there, and I think that's a great thing. There are a lot of great initiatives out there. I think in the end, it's also a matter of resources, really, to be very honest. 1 Acre Fund in the end is a non-profit, so we are bound by the resources that we can generate within our program and that we can attract. And then choices need to be made. And sometimes these are made based on certain outcomes that donors would like or that we believe in. So we cannot cover all terrains, unfortunately. It'd be great if we could do that, but that's just not possible. But I think it's where the different kind of pieces can come together and we can kind of holistically see how to defragment all the initiatives. I think that there's an opportunity there. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Actually, Natalia, I wanted to go back to you because I didn't allow you to complete your point. But before you do, I would like you to respond to one or two of the things you've just heard right now from an IFAD Treasury point of view.
So first of all, I wanted to come back to the point that Karin also made and about, the MDBs or the DFIs, however you want to call us, and the risk appetite that we have. And of course, I mean, I agree, and that was the gist of the G20 recommendation, the report that the G20 did on multilateral development banks. The biggest recommendation was, relook at your risk appetite and use your balance sheet better and more. And of course, there's always a trade-off with, as you said, the precious credit rating, right? Because on the other hand, the credit rating is what allows these banks or these DFIs to get out there and get cheap money from financial markets and channel that money on to countries that normally would have to pay much more if they were to issue bonds themselves. So there are tensions. I agree with you on the one hand, but that's why you would have seen also the Asian Development Bank and how they responded to the G20 report. I think we're all making efforts to relook at the capital adequacy without getting too boring and technical and use our balance sheet better. And that's also what IFAD is in the process of doing. I also wanted to get back to the other point of de-risking the products that we offer. So from an IFAD point of view, the big innovation that we are introducing in the last couple of years is basically direct lending to the private sector, right? This is something that some others already do. EBRD is their main business, but IFAD so far has only been lending to the governments. And then there's always the question, the government implements the projects, but how can you make sure that the money really reaches swiftly Janice and her colleagues? And so that's why IFAD is taking already there more risk by basically adding some private sector exposure to its own balance sheet, which we haven't done before. And that's the big plan for the next replenishment cycle. And not only that, but we're also looking at introducing new instruments like, for example, guarantees and de-risking structures so that the private sector is then incentivized to join and jump in. And that's also, I agree, is a role of the MDBs, this kind of brokerage role. It takes time, but I think the G20 report was a big push for all of us. And IFAD is implementing a few recommendations of that report as well, like the other ones.
Thank you very much, Natalia. I'm going to go to Jim in a moment, but before I do, I'm conscious that I haven't asked you for your thoughts, your opinions, or a question. I'm talking to the room, both here in the virtual room, and of course, people in person here. So, given the range of things that you've heard from the floor here, I'm assuming you might have a follow-up, a question or two, whether it's to Janice on how the funding mechanisms can be changed, can be adapted, improved to help her, or what more we want to see the donors on this platform to do to become more relevant to people at the grassroots or the middle income level. Any thoughts, any questions, perhaps? If not, I'm going to go to Jim. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Yes. You're the gentleman I was talking to before. You're the guy who gave me the 98% success rate in Kenya. Is that right?
98% guy.
He's a 98% guy. That's right. That's right. Yes. Please remind us who you are and your question.
All right. So thank you so much. My name is Troels Meyer Sørensen. I'm from UNDP based in Nairobi. So I thought it was an interesting discussion on the risks. And I think that one of the things that we need to do in this platform is maybe to have a more nuanced discussion of where are the risks really we have on the ground. And I'm talking more about Africa. That's where I've been working the last 15 years. We have a lot of successful initiatives on how to attract commercial lending and how to invest it in SMEs. But we're not that good at explaining the world and the donors about it. And one of the things that I've experienced the last 2 years is that we have this very successful impact fund in Somalia called the Nordic Investment Fund. It's supported by the EU and the Nordic donors. They have $30 million out to 100 Somalian companies with a repayment rate of 98%. So that's impressive, right? A lot of them are on fisheries, on fodder production, et cetera, and et cetera. Now the UN system is trying to take this as a lighthouse, and we're trying to scale it up. So now we're trying to build a regional impact fund to have the same model, but cover more countries with more commercial lending. And what we've found in the UN system is that it's very difficult to rally donors around initiatives that are already proven successful. So I think that we have a challenge in the donor community that we're always looking for new initiatives. It's always as if we're always starting from zero.
Yeah.
I think what we need to do, and this is where these platforms comes into play, we need to look at what financial initiatives are actually working in rural developing countries. And then how do we rally the donors around successful scale-up opportunities instead of always starting from zero? I think that's one of the big challenges.
That's a really interesting reflection there. I'm going to go to you, Jim, because I mean, Troels is working in Somalia and getting 98% return rate, and in Kenya, and you go to the donors and the UN system, etc., and they're running away instead of running to you. It's extraordinary. Please reflect on that. And why would that be, do you think? I'm not attacking you. I'm just wondering, because normally success has many parents, failure is an orphan. Well, we have success, and they're running away as though it's an orphan.
Well, I mean, everybody likes their own pet projects, don't
yes,
they? So,
yes.
That's the obvious one. But I think we actually don't have enough collation of the good examples and really learning from that at the moment. I think there has been an explosion of innovation around this area over the last few years. So I think there's a lot, and that's just a very practical thing that donors could do, is investing in understanding what's working, what's not, in what context and why, what are some of the returns on investment of that, and giving a better overview of what would make a good investment for donors. The other thing I wanted to say was I think it's really important to make a distinction between different types of leveraging private sector finance. So Natalia has basically been saying, how can you basically leverage in capital markets? But I think as Chris Isaac was making a really good point yesterday, the other way of thinking about it, and you need both, of course, is if you support a business to get going and they then start drawing in their own finance and their own capital, then that's also another way of leveraging. And then maybe they start to employ small scale producers, or they start to connect with other small and medium scale enterprises. And so that's also part of the leveraging. So I think we have to be really clear about those different ways of leveraging And I think we also need to do a fair bit of disaggregating between what does it mean if you're working with very small scale farmers? What does it mean if you're working with small and medium scale enterprises? What does it mean if you're working with larger scale enterprises who are then having a flow on effect with a range of other smaller enterprises? What does it mean if you're working with a larger scale enterprise? And I think we're doing a little too much of throwing everything into the one bucket. Yeah. And we have to recognize that for all of those different sorts of clients and their needs, as you were talking about, Agnes, you probably need slightly different tailored models with different levels of technical input, different financial models, different risk management mechanisms. And I think that's, again, we're having a better assessment funded by donors about how you look at these different sort of models and what's working and what's not would be super useful.
All right. I see Karen is nodding quite vigorously, especially at your latter point. Or explain why you were nodding so vigorously. What did you agree with, Karen?
So I actually want to talk about Jim's first point, which is this strong need to collect data on it. And that's exactly why the GDPRD set up this multi-donor working group on blended finance last year. Was precisely that, to try and get the finance specialists in the donor agencies to meet together, to share data about their blended finance transactions, to have a sort of private space where they could not only share data, but be honest about what succeeded and what failed. So we have a better picture. Instead of just collecting a group of stories, we build some more solid data on this. And I think this working group is absolutely critical going forward. And I think getting this working group to get to that level of donors feeling comfortable and confident enough to share their data on blended finance and to share their successes and failures with each other, not with the rest of the world, I think will be a hugely important breakthrough to get them to then scale up some of those 98% success stories.
Lovely. Thank you, Karen. We have another question from, yes, Madam there, yes. Please tell us who you are as well.
Hi, thanks so much for the opportunity to raise a sort of comment and question. My name's Natasha Hayward. I'm with the World Bank and I'm the program manager for the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, which actually quite helpfully Chris Isaac also mentioned, I think, a couple of times in his remarks. And I wanted to really underscore, I think, the really valuable points that folks in this discussion have made. You know, Karen noting the drop in the ocean when you actually look at the volumes of financing. The comment over there around kind of the value and the need to recognize existing instruments, and your last point around the need to disaggregate. I couldn't agree more, and that really reflects, I think, our experience in GAFSP. You know, the sort of the need for financing, you know, we try to think of it as a continuum, right? There's a sort of a progression model from, you know, smallholders themselves, I think acknowledged yesterday as the first sort of private sector actors in the space, you know, and how governments can support with the enabling environment and some of those more public sector type investments for disorganized smallholders, you know, all the way through to the larger commercial end. And at each different point, if you kind of segment along that continuum, the way that you structure the investment, the degree of de-risking or subsidy or concessional portion of financing is going to look very different. So I think it's really important to sort of understand and break that down a little bit in terms of what exists out there, addressing those different targets along that continuum. And there is some data. I mean, I'm sort of, you know, Shamba is doing a great job on data collection. I was at another meeting last week, facilitated by the bank, where an organization, Brighter Bridges, shared their analysis of the financing in this space, which showed a massive gap in the missing middle space, but particularly in those lower order, smaller ticket investment sizes, you know, sort of, you know, more a few $100,000 to sort of $2 million. And there's a real dearth of financing there. But that's where, to my mind, you know, we've got this opportunity with donors around this platform. The use of donor financing to de-risk, to come in as that grant portion alongside the DFIs, again, in this structured, segmented way that doesn't sort of crowd out inappropriately, but for that sector of the market provides that concessionality at a higher order and with a much lower appetite for returns than our commercial friends are going to be interested in. So that balance is going to look very different along the continuum in terms of the degree of de-risking, the expected returns, and how we can try and shepherd and then share information to know who's out there so that this adds up in a much more complementary way along that kind of progression model.
And are you happy with what you've heard here, as in the last couple of days?
You know, what is great is to have, I think, a recognition of these points, right? The fact that there is a massive financing need, that the donors have a clear role to play in that, not only through the, I mean, I guess to your point, it's not just, of course, you know, there's an interest in bilateral projects, but there are also strong, good multilateral players that have a presence, who are active in fora for coordination, and where we can really reach scale to 2030. Because I think there needs to be a massive push now, right, in the 5 years to 2030, to really direct that donor financing as efficiently as possible. The data is there showing where the gaps are. We need to come together in forum like this, the working group that Karen had mentioned, to look at what's working and try and coordinate where that financing goes.
So thank you very much indeed for that. We really are in the home straight right now. But that's what I was doing. I was I was signaling that we have about 3 or 4 minutes before I want to wrap this part up, and then we'll have a couple of closing thoughts from 1 or 2 of our colleagues here. So Natalia, how are you going to use your 30 seconds? Okay, 45 seconds.
No, thank you. I just wanted to respond to one point, actually a reflection that came, because we spoke a lot about data, and we spoke about the data of the money that goes into blended finance products. But we, at least today, maybe you did it yesterday, we haven't spoken so much about the data that actually comes out and the evidence about, you know, again, the impact data. And I just want to signal it because both when we speak to donors, when we speak to lenders, and also when we speak to investors, and coming back to your point, what is the best way to showcase successes is really to show what you've done with the money and how sustainable the project was 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the line. If we don't have those data, and I know that this is a shared problem because, you know, the countries where we operate and the projects that we finance are in very difficult realities, right? So when it comes to M&E, it's difficult to gather those data. And I know it because I also worked in operations, and it really opened my eyes about the difficulties on getting solid data on M&E. But this is the best way to showcase to the donors and to investors, you know, what the successes are. I just wanted to say that about the other point about data. And I think that there could be a lot of synergies with other actors working in the same areas.
Sure.
Especially when it comes to the private sector, it's very difficult to gather data because those are private projects and privately implemented.
All right, thank you very much, Natalia. I'm going to give everybody else, I'm going to be brutal, 30 seconds, but you don't have to take it. If you feel you've said everything, you don't have to take it. But if you feel you've said everything and you want to leave us wanting more, that's fine. I appreciate your efforts. But if you think there's something that I didn't quite land and I just need 30 more seconds just to punch the point home, because the Agora is going to close very soon and you want to leave us thinking something as we go, then I'll give you the chance to do so. Agnes, do you have? Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much. Tim, yes.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, impact is critical. So for us, we compare 1 acre fund supported farmers with control farmers year round to assess impact. And we do this rigorously with statistically randomized trials and making sure that data is very clear. But I just want to mention something else about de-risking. So one type of support that we've gotten from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is really, really impactful on catalytic, if we're talking about catalytic support, they offer a first loss facility. So I mentioned the 96% repayment, but there's a 4% non-repayment. Yeah. They participate a share in that non-repayment every year that we can draw down. And what that does is it shows that we are reliable to other lenders, and that actually catalyzes lending from other institutions.
Very good.
I think this is an example where you can really catalyze grant funding.
It's a very good example. Thank you, Tim.
I want to share that. Yeah.
Excellent. Karen, do you need your 30 seconds? Do you have 30 seconds worth of thoughts?
30 seconds. Just one thing, I think it's really worth to Natalia and is it Tim's last point? I think looking at outcome financing is one way to really value the impacts. And we go into that in the report that we did with the Global Donor Platform. So I encourage people to look at that. But I think my main message is the GDPRD has to make it easy for donors to share data on all these experiments that are happening in a meaningful way. And the working group that they've set up is the best way to do that.
Thank you very much, Karen. Janice, you're going to go to Kenya soon. What will you say?
3 asks. 1, we need to advocate for policy reforms that support youth financing. The one that we have in Kenya is outdated. Kenya Youth and Agribusiness Strategy, expired in 2022. And we look at collateral, how flexible finances can be when it comes to collateral. We need low interest rates, flexible repayment periods that are aligned with the agricultural sector. For instance, during harvesting period, that is when, of course, we can repay. Infrastructure development. We also have an ask in strengthening the M&E to measure the impact of empowerment funds that exist. A study that was done previously in Wajir County in 2019 indicated that the repayment rate of this fund is only at 20%. Wow. And that gives you in my, is it that the business failed? Is it that the young people lack integrity? They're not responsible? Yeah, so we really need to look at and all that. And the final ask is, we're asking that you foster youth-led organizations and networks like young professionals in agriculture development so that they can work on the advocacy and help trickle this down to young people out there through our online cafes and even community cafes. Yeah.
Okay. Janice, thank you very much and good luck with that. And I hope that things work out far better than they have thus far, because you're 8 years in and we want to see your dreams being fulfilled, okay? We all want that here in this room. You've really touched us. So have you, Maureen, and Prosper before. Jim, you are the senior advisor to the platform. What do you want us to take away, particularly given the excellent and helpful briefing that we all got before we started this meeting, which helped to frame so much of our discussions, and what will the GDPRD take into the new strategic plan?
I thought you said you wanted 30 seconds.
I'm giving you 35.
Look, I think a lot of what you've asked is sort of more or less been covered, but I think I'd just like to raise one last point that I think is really important for donors when we're thinking about leverage. And so a lot of the discussion in the last couple of days has also been about the enabling environment. So in terms of national level policy, but also in terms of how the global financial architecture is working and what that means for lower income countries in terms of their debt and currency and all of that, those sorts of issues. So I think making sure that donors are actually investing in the processes that are going to help countries improve their policy frameworks, help the global financial architecture improve and ease up some of those issues as well. So I think that's just another really critical dimension of the leveraging that donors could be thinking about.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Jim. That concludes this particular synthesis panel. Give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you very much indeed. You are now free to leave the stage. Thank you very much indeed. That's wonderful. Excellent. Okay, so we are coming to the end of this AGA, but there are a couple of final contributions. Oh, you want to, okay, a little family photo, as they say. Family photo. That's what they call it at the G20. Family photo. Wonderful. Thank you very much to Jim, to Karen, to Tim, to Natalie, to Agnes, and to Karen. Thank you very much indeed. And Janice, of course, yes. Right. Now, Maurizio Navarro, as you know, is the secretary of the, the coordinator of the Secretariat of the GDPRD. I would like to ask him what he has learned from the past couple of days, the expectations, because I mean, there's the team, you might have seen them on LinkedIn, this wonderful team that's been working away and that's delivered this conference I think superbly. This is my third. I think it's excellent. But Maurizio, what are you thinking, and what do you want us to go away with? What have you learned?
Thanks, Henry, and thanks everyone for being here with us for these 2 days. It was really amazing, and I think you know, we had such diverse and rich panels and discussions that we will really need to take our time to think and distill all that came out during these 2 days and understand what we can do also as a platform to bring this conversation forward. So very exciting days. I have a few points. I will be very brief, I promise. The first thing that really struck me is that, you know, no matter how you put it, there's still a lot of work to do by the entire community in understanding innovative financing, in particular on blending, because we focused a lot on blending, but also on climate funds and all, you know, all that really revolves around innovative financing. Because no matter how you turn this around, this is a big cultural shift for the donor community, but also for the rest of the community. So it's a cultural change. It will require time, and no matter how much we are in a hurry, we will need to take our time to really absorb and understand well how this is done. But the willingness is there, so at least we are starting from a good point. The second point that really also surprised me a little bit, and it shouldn't, because the donor platform has always been about really putting data available to the donor community, is how impressive is the work that the community is doing on data. Just think about the presentations we've had today, but you know what we've heard also from Karen and the data on the blended finance transactions. And you know, the donor platform has really invested a lot of energy and time on data, and we will continue doing so. So there's a wealth of information over there. So it will be very interesting to see how this will be evolving, in particular also thinking about artificial intelligence. You know, the thought goes there, and we know that, you know, looking at the current environment, Europe, for example, is lagging behind other countries. But I mean, there's no other way that we will be somehow forced to go that direction. And I would say that we need to be encouraged to go towards that direction, because it will be really also there a paradigm shift for the donors to use AI. The third point is that, you know, there is clearly a disconnect in the language that the donor community speaks, and what we heard from the rural entrepreneurs, from the indigenous people this morning. It's always been like this a little bit, but I think, you know, it's always striking to see, and it's always very interesting and important for us to understand how to bridge this gap and how to really respond to the communities that we need to serve, because after all, we're doing all this for that. We're doing all this for development. So it will be extremely important for us to align a little bit and try to get closer to that language. The intention is there, but the language is also still lacking. And then my final point is that despite this distance, I just, you know, would like to refrain what my friend and colleague Jim said just before, the explosion of innovation. We see so many things happening, such an active community that finances so many different initiatives, and you know that there's a great willingness really to impress change by the donor community. Just that, you know, as I said before, I think there's a big cultural shift happening, and this will require time. So I think we'll need really to understand and give us the time to absorb, even though the world is running at a different pace maybe, but you know, it's an important shift that is happening. On this note, I would like again to thank all of you before I give the floor to our co-chairs for the closing. But also I would like to underline and you know, be grateful for the immense work they've done to the Secretariat team. And I would like to spell out their names: Michelle, Alessandro, Sierra, Monique, Carlotta, and also the people from our IFAD division who joined voluntarily to help us for this conference: Laura, Serena, Eubin, and Z. Sorry if I mispronounce some of the names. So really a big round of applause to them. They've been amazing. And you know, the conference was really flawless from that perspective, and I really have, you know, to thank them for the extremely massive work they've done over the past month. So thank you very much, colleagues, and over to you, co-chairs.
So I will start. So first of all, thank you also from my side for attending the Haga event. As co-chair of the Global Donor Platform, it was an honor for me to participate and to meet all of you. We as donors, I bring at home many insights that we all can reflect on, work on in different ways with different approaches. Sustainable food system transformation, blended and innovative finance, a private investment, inclusive partnership, minimizing risk, biggest company engaging smallest one, ensuring that the smallest can grow, donor coordination and sharing on data. The good news that came out from our discussion is that we already have a solution. As for example, there are already innovative finance solutions. It remains the need to scale up the solution, to use, to put in place, particularly strengthening coordination and policy. Let me say allow me to say that event like Haga can be considered as a good start, a small but an important brick, we can say, for the strengthening and for the coordination, precisely because it brings together the actors of the complex architecture of organization that are working on the food system and on agriculture development. So thank you again, and I will pass the floor to Bruce. Thank you.
Thanks, Frederick, and I'll just take that last thought and also add some of my own. Just some of the thoughts that have come out for me in the last few days. First of all, not new. We need to keep the whole of the food system in view. We can't just focus or emphasize certain parts of it to the detriment of others. Otherwise, our investments become imbalanced, and the outcomes are not really the progress we'd like to see. Then, of course, understanding not only our own incentives, but also incentives of other food systems actors, why they need investment, what they do with investments, and of course the private sector, whom we hope are trying to partnership with, what are their incentives, and so I said yesterday, when we ride the beast, where does this beast want to go, and how can we work together with it? Then the third point, linking and layering multiple de-risking measures. And the more we move from, I'd say, stable contexts into fragile contexts, the more it becomes important to be able to manage the risks of these contexts and still incentivize ingoing investment. So that's a very important aspect. Just picking up some of the last thoughts on the panel we had just beforehand, and a risk factor I don't think we'd really discussed yet. That's the risk factor funders, and so we're a self-reflection here that we had a bit of criticism that we're here today, gone tomorrow, often leaving investors holding the baby because we're on to the next innovative thing, and here we've got to think about how do we in the eyes of our partners become a more stable entity, a more dependable entity. As we go into investments, can we be sure that they can be sure that we'll still be here 5 to 10 years, or perhaps even longer, on a particular investment course? So we need to be there for the long term, and thank you for people in this room who have really pointed that out. Then just two last points, again, data. Maurizio mentioned beforehand, I think that's really important. We as a donor platform need to continue to work on that. We had a lot of input. There's a rich amount of data out there. There's a lot more that needs to be basically brought together. We have to condense that to information, then on to knowledge, and that has to be presented. one way or another, and hope we'll be part of that mix somewhere. And then just quite finally leading on to there's a question of communication. We had it on Indigenous groups here from Balasa Isa this morning. They always have to integrate, they always have to simulate with our terms. Often to be more effective, we have to be able to reach out to them. And I think in terms of communication, what we had yesterday, the young entrepreneurs, to hear from their perspective, what's going on, where the rubber hits the road. I thought that was communicatively very, very important for us who are used to falling asleep over lock frames. I'll put it quite bluntly like that, because that really brought to life what are the objectives in all this. And so, yes, I think we have, if I look at the logo of the Donna platform, we have another thread in the tapestry as we go forward. I think these are threads, not worms. I mean, because of worms are also important for the fertility and aeration of our soils, but I think they're threads, and we're trying to build a tapestry. But worms, I like it. And this will be great as we move into the new year. Into 2025, we will be thinking again about the future through our white paper, mentioning that yesterday, and doing this with our executive board, but also through various events throughout the year, which I hope you'll be able to participate in one way or another, and keep these rich discussions alive. I also want to again shout out what Maurizio said, so a shout out to the Secretariat who really has held all this together. They're really the people who really pull that tapestry together, and who will definitely be making a great summary of this meeting. And of course, to you, everybody who's been here, be it online or come here in person, we want to say thank you to you also, and look forward to seeing and conversing with you in the year to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, co-chairs. Thank you, Maurizio. Thank you to the team, the Secretariat. And with that, I think we can formally declare this ADA 2024 closed. Enjoy the rest of your day, your lunch, safe travels if you're flying out. Enjoy Rome if you live here. And I'll see you again soon. Thank you very much.